Greetings, weary travellers of the day. Welcome to the sanctuary of Get Cozy Sleep. You have walked a long road today. You have carried burdens that were perhaps too heavy for your shoulders, and you have run races that seem to have no finish line. But here, the noise of the traffic fades into the gentle hum of the wind. Here, the demands of the clock dissolve into the timeless rhythm of a heartbeat. There is nothing you need to achieve in this space. There is no one you need to impress. You only need to be. If your heart has ever felt like a dry seed waiting in the dark earth for a drop of rain, if you have ever felt that your own strength was too small, your own voice too quiet for the rushing world around you, and if you find peace in the texture of rough stone and the silent dignity of things that grow slowly, then this story is your refuge tonight. So, let the tension in your jaw loosen, unclench your hands, let the weight of the blanket become a shield against the worries of tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let the walls of your room melt away like mist in the morning sun. We are travelling back 2,000 years to the ancient city of Jericho. The air here is warm and still, smelling of sun-baked clay and dry herbs. The ground beneath us is dusty and solid. Breathe in the ancient peace, exhale the modern chaos. The boy who watered stones. The heat of Jericho was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight. It pressed down from the cloudless sapphire sky, heavy and silent, draping itself over the rooftops like a thick-wool blanket. It was the kind of heat that slowed time itself, turning the bustling movements of the morning market into the sluggish, dreamlike motions of the afternoon. In the heart of this ancient city, known to travellers as the City of Palms, stood the high-walled estate of Eliphaz the merchant. To the outside world, the estate was a fortress of white limestone, blindingly bright under the midday sun. But to Silas, it was simply a collection of shadows. Silas was 10 summers old. Though his small, wiry frame made him appear no older than 7, he was a child of the dust, an orphan who had drifted into the service of Eliphaz's household like a stray leaf blown in by the desert wind. He possessed nothing but a tunic of rough, unbleached linen that hung loosely on his shoulders, and a pair of worn leather sandals that had been discarded by one of the stable boys. And yet, Silas considered himself rich. His wealth did not lie in gold coins or fine silks, but in his secret knowledge of the shadows. While the other servants, the cooks, the stable hands, the water carriers, complained loudly about the oppressive heat, wiping sweat from their brows with the backs of their hands, Silas moved through the estate with the silent grace of a desert fox. He knew exactly where the sun could not reach. He knew that at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, the tall cypress tree by the granary would cast a long, thin slice of shade across the cobblestones, just wide enough for a boy to press his back against. He knew that the stone wall behind the kitchen, though scorching on one side, remained cool and damp on the other, where the moss clung to the crevices. Silas was the sweeper of the outer courtyards. It was a humble task, one that rendered him invisible to the important people who walked the corridors, guests of Eliphaz, merchants with oiled beards and robes of purple dye, would walk right past him as he crouched with his broom of bound twigs, never lowering their gaze to see the boy who gathered the dust their sandals left behind. He did not mind their indifference. In fact, he preferred it. Invisibility was a form of protection. As long as he was unseen, he was safe. As long as he was quiet, he could belong to the world of the wolves and the lizards, a world far more interesting than the loud, argumentative world of men. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick with the scent of drying figs and the sharp, resinous smell of the cedar pillars. Silas finished sweeping the steps of the lower terrace, his movements rhythmic and slow. Swish, swish, swish. The sound was a whisper against the stone, a lullaby for the drowsy afternoon. He paused, leaning onto his broom, and looked up at the main garden of Eliphaz. It was a paradise forbidden to him. Through the wrought-iron gates, he could see the shimmer of the great fountain, spraying precious water into the air. He could see the lush pomegranate trees, their branches heavy with fruit that looked like red jewels. He could hear the soft cooing of the doves that nested in the olive groves. It was a world of abundance, green and wet and alive. But it was not Silas's world. His domain was the perimeter, the edges, the places where the manicured garden ended and the rough reality began. He picked up his basket of sweepings, dry leaves, broken pottery shards, and the endless pervasive dust of Jericho, and began his trek toward the back of the estate. His destination was the place the other servants called the Dead Corner. To reach it, he had to walk along the western wall. The limestone here was old, much older than the new additions Eliphaz had built. These stones were massive, hewn by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. They were pitted and scarred by time, their surfaces like the topographical maps of a rugged country. Silas ran his left hand along the wall as he walked. It was a habit he could not break. He liked the feel of the stone against his palm. It was rough, warm, and solid. It felt permanent. In a life where everything else had been taken away, his parents, his home, his name, the wall was a constant. It was always there, standing guard, unmoving and silent. "Hello, old friend," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the chirping of the cicadas. He imagined the wall could feel his touch. He imagined that the stones absorbed the heat of the day so they could keep the lizards warm at night. He had a theory, one he kept entirely to himself, that the stones were not dead. They were simply very, very slow. If you watched them for 1,000 years, perhaps you would see them take a breath. As he walked further from the main house, the noise of the household faded. The clattering of pots in the kitchen, the shouting of the overseer, the laughter of the maids had all drifted away, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. The path narrowed. The smooth paving stones gave way to packed earth and gravel. The manicured hedges of rosemary and hyssop disappeared, replaced by stubborn, thorny weeds that clawed at the hem of his tunic. Most people would have turned back here. The heat seemed to concentrate in this narrow alleyway, trapped between the high outer wall and the back of the storage sheds. But Silas quickened his pace. There was a lightness in his step now. He was approaching his sanctuary. The Dead Corner was a triangular patch of land at the very edge of the property, wedged between the junction of two great walls. It was the dumping ground for the estate. Whatever was broken, whatever was useless, whatever was too ugly for the eyes of Eliphaz, ended up here. Piles of cracked roof tiles lay in heaps like the bones of some stone giant. Rusted iron tools, half buried in the dirt, twisted like dead snakes. The ground was hard, rocky and unforgiving. The head gardener, a man named Jabin who had arms like tree trunks and a voice like grinding millstones, had told Silas on his first day, "Throw the trash in the corner, boy. Nothing grows there. The ground is cursed with salt and stone. Even the weeds die in that corner." Silas had nodded, his eyes wide. But as he stepped into the dead corner now, shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun reflecting off the white rubble, he did not see a cursed place. He saw a kingdom of quiet things. He emptied his basket onto a pile of dry leaves, the sound a soft crunch in the stillness. Then, instead of turning back to the house, he sat down. He found his favourite spot, a flat, smooth rock nestled in the shadow of the great wall. He pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his thin arms around them. Here, the air was still. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracks in the wall, swirling like tiny stars in a galaxy of gold. A small, grey gecko scurried across a broken clay pot, freezing mid-step as it sensed Silas's presence. Silas smiled. "I see you," he whispered. The gecko blinked, its throat pulsing rapidly, then darted into a crevice. Silas closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the warm stone wall. He breathed in the smell of the dead corner. It did not smell of rot or waste. It smelled of baked earth, of hot flint, and of something else, something faint and sweet, like dried hay. This was his secret orchard. There were no pomegranates here, no fountains, no shade-giving cedars, only broken things and rejected stones. But to Silas, there was a strange, haunting beauty in the brokenness. It was a place that didn't demand anything. It was a place that let him rest. He sat there for a long time, listening to the silence, letting the peace of the stones seep into his bones. He did not know yet that he was not alone in this corner. He did not know that just a few feet away, hidden behind a mound of jagged rocks, something was waiting for him. Something that looked like death, but was desperately holding on to life. Silas opened his eyes. A flash of brown amidst the white-grey rubble caught his attention. It was twisted, gnarled, and looked like a piece of driftwood thrown up by a dry ocean. He stood up, his sandals crunching softly on the gravel, and took a step forward. He was about to meet Barnabas. Silas moved deeper into the dead corner, his sandals crunching softly on a carpet of crushed gravel and ceramic splinters. To anyone else, this sound would have been the noise of walking on trash. But to Silas, it was the sound of history breaking under his weight. He navigated the mounds of debris with the reverence of a treasure hunter exploring a lost city. The ground here was uneven, a chaotic topography of discarded things. To his left rose a small hillock of broken roof tiles, their clay surfaces baked to a reddish-orange hue by years of relentless sun. Silas liked to imagine they were the scales of a sleeping dragon that had curled up to die in the backyard of Eliphaz the merchant. To his right lay a tangled mess of olive branches, pruned seasons ago, now bleached white as bone, their leaves long since turned to dust. Most servants hurried through this task, emptying their baskets and fleeing back to the shade of the colonnades. They saw only ugliness here. They saw the jagged edges of broken pots that could cut a foot. They saw the scorpions that sometimes hid beneath the rocks. They saw a place where things went when they were no longer useful. But Silas possessed a different kind of vision. He saw the dignity in the discarded. He paused near a shattered amphora, a large wine jar that had likely cracked during a feast. The bottom half remained intact, lying on its side like a great, open mouth. Silas squatted down, his knees popping slightly, and ran a finger along the rim of the clay. It was rough, still holding the faint, ghostly stain of purple wine in its pores. "You held the best wine in Jericho once," Silas whispered to the broken jar. "You were the centre of the party, and now you're here, resting." He didn't pity the jar. In a way, he envied it. It had done its job. It had served its purpose. And now it was allowed to simply lie in the sun, free from the fear of being dropped, free from the burden of carrying anything ever again. He stood up and dusted off his hands. The heat was intensifying, shimmering in waves off the stone wall behind him, blurring the air like water. It was then that his gaze returned to the strange, twisted shape he'd glimpsed earlier, the driftwood anomaly rising from the sea of stones. He stepped over a coil of rusted wire and approached it. It was a tree, or at least the memory of one. It stood alone in the furthest recess of the corner, wedged between two large boulders that seemed to be trying to crush it. It was not a majestic cedar of Lebanon, nor was it a graceful palm. It was a fig tree, but it was the ugliest, most wretched fig tree Silas had ever seen. It was short and stunted, its trunk no thicker than Silas's own thigh. Its bark was a pale, sickly grey, peeling away in dry flakes like the skin of a leper. The branches were not spreading and green, they were gnarled and knotted, twisting in on themselves as if the tree had grown in great pain, writhing in agony before freezing into wood. It looked less like a plant and more like a statue of suffering carved from grey stone. There were no leaves. Not a single splash of green broke the monotony of the grey branches. It stood stark and naked against the blinding white wall. "You are the king of this place," Silas murmured, tilting his head to study the crooked silhouette. He wondered why the gardeners hadn't hacked it down for firewood. Perhaps it was too small to bother with. Perhaps the wood was too knotted to split easily. Or perhaps, like Silas, it was simply invisible to them, too insignificant to warrant the effort of destruction. Silas reached out a hesitant hand. He wanted to touch it, to see if it was truly stone or wood. His fingertips brushed the trunk. It was warm. Not the warmth of a living body, but the dry, accumulated heat of the sun. The texture was rough, like a cat's tongue scratching against his skin. He traced the lines of the bark, following the deep fissures that ran up the trunk like dried riverbeds. He expected the wood to crumble under his touch, to disintegrate into powder like the rotten olive branches nearby. But it didn't. Beneath the peeling skin, the wood was hard, solid. It had a density to it, a stubborn resistance. It was dead. Surely, and nothing could survive in this corner without water, buried under rubble, baked by the Jericho sun day after day. It was just a monument to a life that had failed. And yet, Silas frowned. He leaned closer, squinting against the glare, near the base of the trunk, where the tree disappeared into the hard, packed earth. The bark was slightly darker. He knelt down, ignoring the sharp gravel digging into his shins. He scraped away a handful of loose pebbles and dust. The earth around the base was compacted, hard as iron. But as he cleared the debris, he saw the roots. They were thick, ropey things, diving straight down into the unforgiving ground. They didn't spread out across the surface looking for easy moisture. They plunged deep, disappearing into the darkness below the rocks. There was a fierceness to those roots. They looked like desperate fingers gripping the edge of a cliff. "Are you sleeping?" Silas asked softly. "Or are you gone?" He pressed his ear against the trunk, just as he had done with the stone wall. He closed his eyes, shutting out the glare of the sun, shutting out the image of the dead branches. He listened. He heard the wind sighing through the gaps in the wall. He heard the distant braying of a donkey in the city streets. He heard his own breath, steady and shallow. He did not hear a heartbeat. He did not hear the flow of sap. But he felt something. It was not a sound, but a stillness, a waiting. It was the feeling one gets when entering a room where someone is holding their breath, hiding in the dark. The tree did not feel like the dead olive branches. The olive branches felt empty, light, hollow. This tree felt heavy. It held a weight. It was occupying its space with intention. Silas pulled back and looked at the gnarled branches again. He saw a scar on one of the lower limbs, where a branch had been snapped off long ago. The wound had healed over, forming a hard, smooth knot. "You've been fighting a long time, haven't you?" A sudden gust of hot wind swept through the dead corner, kicking up a swirl of dust. The dry branches of the tree rattled against each other. Clack, 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 like dry bones. It sounded like a cry of thirst. Silas looked at his own hands. They were dirty, covered in the grey dust of the courtyard and the red dust of the tiles. They were small hands, rough from gripping the broom handle, calloused from work. They were empty. He looked back at the tree. It stood amidst the broken pottery and the rejected stones. The only thing in this corner that was still upright. It was ugly. It was unwanted. It was alone. Just like him. A strange sensation bloomed in Silas's chest. It was not pity. Pity was looking down on something. This was recognition. He saw his own reflection in the twisted wood. He saw the same stubborn refusal to disappear. "You are not trash," Silas said, his voice firm in the silence. The word surprised him. He hadn't meant to speak so loudly. "They put you here with the broken pots, but you're not a pot. You're a tree." He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked around the dead corner. There was no water here. The nearest well was in the main courtyard, guarded by the other servants. The cisterns were for the master's garden, for the pomegranates and the palms. Water in Jericho was precious. It was not wasted on dead things in the garbage heap. If he was caught bringing water here, Jabin the gardener would beat him. Or worse, Eliphaz would cast him out onto the streets. Silas looked at the dry, cracked earth around the roots. He imagined the roots screaming in silence, clawing at the dark rocks, searching for a drop of moisture that wasn't there. He couldn't fix the broken amphora. He couldn't put the roof tiles back together. But this... He looked at the sun. It was past midday. The guests would be arriving soon for the afternoon meal. That meant the foot washing basins would be filled, and after the feet were washed, the water, muddy, brown, unwanted water, would be thrown into the gutters. Silas bit his lip. He looked at the tree one last time. "Wait for me," he whispered. He turned and walked back toward the path, leaving the dead corner behind. But the silence of the place no longer felt empty. It felt like a secret kept between two friends. The tree was no longer just a piece of wood. It was a promise. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, dragging the shadows of the palm trees across the courtyard like stretching fingers. Inside the main house of Eliphaz, the air was thick with the chaotic energy of hospitality. 3 merchants from Damascus had arrived within the hour, their caravan trailing dust and noise into the quiet order of the estate. Now, the inner rooms buzzed with the sounds of commerce and comfort. There was the heavy thud of saddlebags being dropped, the clinking of silver cups, and the rich, savoury aroma of roasting lamb mixed with the sharp scent of mint tea. Silas stood in the shadows of the colonnade, clutching his broom, watching the ritual of arrival. He watched as the servants rushed forward with basins of water and linen towels. The merchants sat on the low benches, groaning with relief as they unstrapped their sandals. Their feet were caked with the white dust of the Jordan Valley, swollen from the long journey. Silas watched the water. He saw the clear, cool liquid poured from earthen pitchers into the copper basins. He saw the servants scrub the weary feet, the water turning from transparent to a cloudy, murky brown. It swirled with the dirt of 100 miles. It was soiled, it was waste. To Jabin the gardener, this water was filth, fit only to be tossed into the stone gutters that ran out to the street, where it would evaporate in minutes on the hot cobblestones. But to Silas, standing in the shadows with the memory of the dead corner fresh in his mind, that muddy water was liquid gold. He waited. He possessed the infinite patience of the overlooked. He waited until the merchants had been ushered into the dining hall. He waited until the servants had gathered the towels and hurried off to the laundry. The copper basins were left sitting on the stone floor, heavy with their burden of dirty water, waiting to be emptied. Silas moved. He did not run. Running attracted attention. He drifted. He moved like a cloud passing over the sun. He reached into the folds of his tunic and pulled out a cracked clay bowl he had salvaged from the trash heap earlier, a bowl that had lost its rim but still held its belly. He approached the nearest basin. The water was still warm. He dipped his bowl into the copper vessel, trying to make no sound. Glug, glug. The brown liquid filled his container. It smelled of travel, of dust, of sweat, of leather. It was the scent of the world outside the walls. He filled the bowl to the brim, the surface tension trembling. He looked around. No one was watching. The kitchen staff were arguing about the sauce for the lamb. The gatekeeper was dozing in his niche. Silas turned and began his pilgrimage. The walk back to the dead corner felt different this time. Before, it had been a walk of duty, a trudge toward the garbage heap. Now, it was a mission. He carried the bowl with both hands, his elbows tucked tight against his ribs to absorb the shock of his steps. He walked with the solemnity of a high priest carrying the sacred oil. Every step was a calculation. He had to keep the water level steady. A splash was a tragedy. A spilled drop was a theft from the life he was trying to save. He passed the rose bushes, which were drinking their fill from the irrigation channels. He passed the great fountains, which threw water into the air just for the vanity of the sound. He ignored them all. They were the privileged. They did not need him. He slipped through the narrow gap between the storehouses, the heat rising to meet him, and stepped once more into the silence of his sanctuary. The dead corner was waiting. The sun had shifted, and the shadow of the great wall had lengthened, plunging the base of the gnarled tree into a deep purple shade. Silas approached the tree. It looked even drier than before. If that were possible, the bark seemed to gasp in the heat. "I am back," Silas whispered. He knelt down on the sharp gravel. He did not pour the water immediately. He wanted to do this right. This was not just watering, it was an introduction. He looked at the twisted trunk. In the softening light of the afternoon, the knots in the wood looked less like deformities and more like muscles. The way the trunk thickened at the base, anchoring itself into the rock, reminded Silas of the stories the old cook used to tell, stories of giants who slept beneath the mountains, waiting for the earth to wake them up. "You are not a stick," Silas decided, tilting his head. "You're too strong to be a stick. You're sleeping. You're holding on." He thought about a name. A tree with such a fierce grip on the earth needed a name. It couldn't be a flower name, or a soft name. It needed a name that sounded like rock and root. "Barnabas," he said softly. He remembered the name from a traveller who had visited months ago. The man had said it meant son of encouragement, one who consoles. Silas didn't have anyone to console him, so he would console the tree. And perhaps, in the quiet way of growing things, the tree would console him back. "Barnabas," he said again, testing the weight of the word. "I have brought you a drink, Barnabas. It is not from the well. It is from the travellers. It has seen the world." Silas leaned forward. With steady hands, he tipped the clay bowl. He poured the water slowly, aiming for the circle of cracked earth he'd cleared around the trunk. The reaction was immediate. Hiss! The dry ground let out a soft sigh as the water touched it. Bubbles of air rose to the surface and popping as the liquid soaked into the parched soil. The earth drank greedily, darkening from a pale, dusty beige to a deep, rich chocolate brown. Silas watched, mesmerized. The water didn't pool, it vanished. It was sucked down, 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 pulled by the invisible thirst of the roots below. He poured until the bowl was empty. A dark, damp circle now ringed the base of the tree. It looked like a halo of life in the wasteland of white stones. He sat back on his heels, watching the wet earth. He placed his hand on the trunk again. "Did you feel that?" he asked. "It reached you, didn't it?" He imagined the water travelling down through the dark, cooling the heated wood, softening the hard casing of the roots. He imagined a tiny shiver of relief passing through the sleeping giant. He knew, logically, that one bowl of dirty water was nothing. It was a drop in the ocean of the desert's heat. Jabin would laugh at him. Eliphaz would scoff. What is one bowl against the sun? But as Silas sat there, watching the damp earth hold its colour against the encroaching grey of the evening, he felt a strange sense of power. Not the power of command like Eliphaz had, but the power of participation. He had done something. He had changed the condition of the world, even if it was just 1 square foot of it. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the swift twilight of the desert washed over Jericho. The dead corner turned from white and grey to blue and silver. The first stars began to prick the velvet sky above the walls. Silas remained sitting by Barnabas. He felt a kinship with this tree, this sleeping giant. They were both survivors. They were both living on the scraps that others threw away. "Sleep now, Barnabas," Silas whispered, patting the rough bark one last time. "I will find more, I promise." He stood up, hiding his empty bowl under his tunic. He turned to leave, but he felt different. He was no longer just a sweeper of dust. He was a keeper. He had a secret charge. The night air was cooling rapidly, bringing with it the scent of jasmine from the neighbour's garden, but Silas carried the smell of wet earth in his memory. It was the smell of hope. He walked back toward the lights of the main house, his shadow stretching long and thin behind him, merging with the shadows of the ancient stones. The boy and the wall and the tree were all part of the same silence now. Time in Jericho was measured not by the hourglass, but by the angle of the shadows on the white walls. And for Silas, time began to bend around a new gravity, the arrival of the strangers. In the days that followed his first offering to Barnabas, a secret rhythm established itself within the chaotic household of Eliphaz. To the overseer, the coming and going of guests was a matter of logistics, how much flour to grind, how many wineskins to open. To Silas, it was a matter of hydrology. Every knock at the heavy cedar gate was a promise of rain. He became a student of feet. From his vantage point in the colonnade, crouched behind a pillar with his broom, he would study the travellers as they dismounted. He learned to read the dust on their sandals like a scribe reading a scroll. The reddish clay meant a traveller from the hill country of Judea. The fine grey powder spoke of the limestone roads of Samaria. The dark, rich loam, clinging in heavy clumps, told of a journey from the riverbanks of the Jordan. Each guest brought a gift, though they did not know it. They brought the moisture of distant lands, captured in the dust of their journey, ready to be washed away into Silas's waiting bowl. The act of stealing the water became a liturgy. It required the precision of a thief and the reverence of a priest. It usually happened in the late afternoon, when the heat of the day finally broke and the household relaxed into the languor of the evening meal. The great copper basins, now discarded in the corner of the courtyard, would sit heavy and still. The water in them was no longer the sparkling liquid that had been drawn from the well. It was opaque, brown, and lukewarm. Most of the servants avoided these basins. They saw only filth. They wrinkled their noses at the smell of sweat and road weariness. But Silas saw a nutrient stew. One particular evening, a caravan of spice merchants from the east arrived. They were large men with booming voices, smelling of cardamom and frankincense. Their feet were broad and calloused, deeply stained by weeks of walking. The water left behind in their basins was particularly thick, swirling with dark sediment. Silas waited until the kitchen fires were stoked and the attention of the staff was fixed on the roasting spits. He moved. He slipped from the shadows, his cracked clay bowl hidden within the folds of his tunic. He approached the nearest basin. The copper was still warm to the touch, retaining the heat of the water. He dipped his bowl. Sloosh. The sound was dangerously loud in the quiet courtyard. Silas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked toward the kitchen archway. The steward was laughing at a joke, his back turned. Silas breathed. He lifted the bowl. It was heavy, brimming with the murky liquid. This was not just water, it was a soup of life. It held the minerals of the desert, the salts of the Dead Sea, the microscopic richness of the earth. He covered the bowl with a scrap of linen cloth to prevent spilling and to hide the contents. Then he began the walk. He had learned to walk without bobbing his head, keeping his upper body perfectly still so the water would not slosh over the rim. He moved through the servants' corridors, past the bickering maids, past the sleeping dogs. He was a ghost carrying a chalice. The transition from the manicured estate to the dead corner was always a shock to the senses. He left behind the smell of roasting meat and entered the smell of dry stone. He left behind the noise of voices and entered the silence of the wind. When he reached the corner, the light was failing. The sky was a bruised purple, bruising into black. Barnabas stood there, a jagged silhouette against the darkening wall. Silas knelt. He did not pour the water immediately. This was the most important part of the ritual. It was the communion. "You have guests tonight, Barnabas," Silas whispered, his voice soft and serious. He set the bowl down on a flat rock. He touched the trunk of the tree. The bark felt different now, or perhaps he was just imagining it. It felt less like dead wood and more like a dormant muscle, tense and waiting. "These are merchants from the east," Silas explained to the tree. He liked to tell Barnabas about the water. It made the gift feel more significant. They brought spices. "Can you smell it?" He leaned over the bowl. The dirty water did, faintly, carry the aroma of the journey, a mix of leather, dust, and a hint of crushed herbs. "This water has walked 1,000 miles just to find you." Silas lifted the bowl. He poured it slowly, circling the trunk. He watched the water hit the prepared earth. The ground, now accustomed to his visits, seemed to accept the offering more readily. It didn't hiss anymore. It swallowed the liquid with a quiet, greedy gulping sound. The dark stain on the earth spread, soaking down to where the hidden roots lay. Silas sat back, wiping his wet hands on his tunic. "Drink deep," he murmured. "Grow strong." He stayed there as the stars came out. This was his favourite time. In the main house, he was boy, or you there, or simply ignored. He was a unit of labour, a thing to be ordered. But here, in the dead corner, he was a provider. He was the rain-bringer. He looked at the tree's twisted branches. In the dim starlight, they looked like arms reaching up in prayer. "I wonder what you will be," Silas mused. "Jabin says you are dead. But Jabin doesn't know about the water from the east. Jabin doesn't know about the water from the high priest's servant. You are drinking the whole world, Barnabas." He imagined the roots down in the dark, sipping this strange cocktail of waters. Perhaps the dust of Samaria would make the wood hard. Perhaps the mud of the Jordan would make the leaves green. Perhaps the sweat of the merchants would give the tree the strength to travel, in its own way, to travel upwards, toward the sun. A cricket began to chirp from the pile of broken tiles. Chirp, 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 chirp. It was a peaceful sound. It was the sound of a living place. Silas realised then that the dead corner was changing. Before, it had been a place of endings. Broken pots came here to be forgotten. Dead branches came here to rot. But now, it was becoming a place of beginnings. He picked up a small, smooth stone and placed it near the base of the tree, marking the number of days he had watered it. There were 12 stones now. 12 days of theft. 12 days of grace. "I have to go," Silas whispered, standing up. "The steward will notice if I'm gone too long." He picked up his empty bowl. It felt lighter now, relieved of its burden. He patted the trunk of Barnabas one last time. "Be here when I come back." It was a foolish thing to say to a tree. Where else would it go? But Silas said it every night. It was his way of asking the tree not to die. He turned and slipped back into the shadows of the alleyway, heading toward the lights and noise of the great house. He walked with a secret smile. Let the masters have their wine and their feasts. Let them have their fountains and their clean, clear water. Silas had something better. He had a secret. He had a mission. And he knew, with the certainty of a child who has found his first true friend, that the dirty water in his bowl was doing a holier work than all the cleansing basins in Jericho. He was washing the feet of the earth. And the earth was grateful. The dead corner was no longer empty. To the hurried glance of a passer-by, it remained a wasteland of broken pottery and grey stones. But to Silas, who had learned the art of becoming as still as the statues in the main hall, it had become a bustling kingdom. He had discovered a secret truth about the world. Life is desperate for an invitation. And water, even dirty water stolen from the feet of merchants, was the most powerful invitation of all. It began on the 14th day. Silas had finished his pouring ritual and was sitting cross-legged on his flat rock, waiting for the earth to drink. The sun was high, baking the air into a shimmering haze, but in the small circle of dampness around Barnabas, the temperature was perhaps a single degree cooler. That single degree was enough. Silas saw movement. It was a tiny, frantic flicker against the white dust. He leaned forward, holding his breath, his eyes narrowing to focus on the microscopic landscape. It was an ant. A harvester ant, reddish-black and armoured like a soldier. It was navigating the treacherous terrain of gravel, moving with the jerky, determined energy of a scout who has lost his way. The ant reached the edge of the damp circle, the dark halo where Silas's water had soaked in. It stopped. Its antennae, thin as hair, quivered in the air, tasting the moisture. Silas watched, fascinated. "Hello, traveller," he whispered. The ant did not retreat. Instead, it scurried forward onto the holy ground of wet earth. It seemed to dance, testing the mud with its legs. Then it turned and raced back the way it came, disappearing into a crack between two roof tiles. "He's going to tell the others," Silas told Barnabas. "You have to be ready. We're going to have company." And they did. By the next evening, a highway had been established. A thin, wavering line of ants marched from the tiles to the tree. They did not climb the trunk, there was nothing there for them yet, but they gathered at the base, harvesting the tiny, moistened grains of soil, drinking the microscopic dew that clung to the pebbles. Silas felt a swell of pride. He was not just keeping a tree alive, he was feeding a civilization. He was the provider for a city of 6-legged citizens. But the ants were just the beginning. 3 days later, the dragon arrived. Silas was dozing in the shadow of the wall, his head resting on his knees, when a soft skitter-scratch sound woke him. He opened one eye without moving his head. There, perched on the lowest, knobby branch of Barnabas, was a lizard. It was a fan-footed gecko, its skin the colour of pale sand, translucent enough that Silas could almost see the beating of its heart. It clung to the wood with splayed toes, its throat pulsing rhythmically. It was looking at Silas with unblinking golden eyes. "You," Silas breathed. He recognised this gecko. He'd seen it darting among the rocks before, a terrified streak of grey, but it had never dared to climb the tree. The tree had been too hot, too dry, too exposed. Now, however, the wood of Barnabas was different. The water from the roots had begun to cool the trunk from the inside out. The evaporation from the soil created a tiny microclimate, a bubble of slightly humid air that shielded the lizard from the worst of the Jericho heat. The gecko was sunning itself, claiming the tree as its throne. "I shall call you Goliath," Silas decided, smiling at the irony. The creature was no longer than his finger, but it held its head with the arrogance of a giant. "You are the guardian of the castle." Goliath blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if accepting the title. From that day on, Silas was never alone. The dead corner had developed a social order. The ants owned the ground, Goliath owned the lower branches, and Silas owned the silence that held them all together. He began to bring gifts for his new friends. Sometimes he would catch a fly that had been stunned by the heat and place it carefully near the tree roots. Goliath would descend, a blur of motion, his sticky tongue snapping out to claim the offering. Silas found joy in these small dramas. In the main house, everyone was fighting for position. The steward shouted at the cooks shouted at the scullery maids, the maids shouted at the sweepers. It was a hierarchy of noise. But here, in the shadow of the wall, the hierarchy was simple. The tree gave shelter, the boy gave water, the creatures gave company. Then came the spider. It appeared one morning after a rare night of heavy dew. Silas arrived early. Before the sun had fully crested the eastern mountains, his tunic damp with the morning mist. He stopped dead in his tracks. Between the main fork of Barnabas's branches, two gnarled limbs that twisted away from each other, hung a masterpiece. It was a web, perfect and geometric, spun from silk so fine it was almost invisible. But this morning, it was not invisible. Every single thread was beaded with tiny droplets of dew. The web caught the first rays of the sun, fracturing the light into 1,000 microscopic rainbows. It looked as though the dead tree was wearing a necklace of diamonds. Silas approached slowly, afraid that even his breath might shatter the crystal structure. A small garden spider sat in the centre of the web, waiting. "Beautiful," Silas whispered. The word felt inadequate. He realised something profound as he looked at the web. For years, the tree had been useless. It cast no shade. It bore no fruit. It was just ugly wood. But now, it was a frame. Without the twisted, awkward shape of the branches, the spider would have had nowhere to anchor its home. The very crookedness of the tree was what made the web possible. The ugliness was a foundation for beauty. Silas sat down on his rock, careful not to disturb the air. He watched the light play across the dewdrops. He thought about the other servants who called this the dead corner. He thought about Eliphaz, who surrounded himself with gold and imported marble. Eliphaz had never seen this. Eliphaz had never seen a diamond necklace made of water and bug spit. Eliphaz was poor, Silas realised with a shock. He was poor because he only saw big things. He missed the tiny miracles. "We are a team now," Silas whispered to the assembly. The ants, the dragon, the weaver, and the boy. He felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. It was a heavy feeling, but it was a good weight, like a warm blanket on a cold night. Before, if he'd stopped watering, only the tree would have suffered. Now, the ants would lose their oasis. Goliath would lose his cool perch. The spider would lose its anchor. He could not stop. He was the engine of this little world. That evening, when he went to the basins to steal the water, he was bolder. He didn't just take the dregs. He scooped deeply, filling his bowl to the very brim. He risked spilling. He risked being seen. Because he wasn't just watering a root anymore. He was sustaining a kingdom. When he returned to the corner, pouring the water with the reverence of a king feeding his subjects, he noticed something else. He leaned in close to the branch where the spider web was anchored. There, just beneath the silk thread, pushing through the rough, grey bark, was a bump. A tiny, green, pointed bump. It was smaller than a grain of rice. If he hadn't been looking at the spider, he would have missed it. Silas's heart stopped, then doubled its beat. He touched it with the tip of his finger. It was smooth. It was firm. It was alive. It was a bud. The sleeping giant was waking up. The bond between a boy and a tree is a silent language, spoken not in words, but in the transfer of heat and the sharing of stillness. As the days of the Jericho summer stretched longer, turning into weeks of relentless, baking sun, Silas found himself drawn closer to the physical reality of Barnabas. It was no longer enough to simply sit near the tree. He needed contact. He began to spend his stolen moments in the dead corner, pressing his body against the trunk. The tree was small, hardly taller than Silas himself, but it was solid. When Silas sat with his back against the rough bark, he felt grounded. It was as if the tree, with its deep, secret grip on the earth's core, was anchoring the boy, preventing him from floating away into the dusty winds of his uncertain life. One afternoon, when the heat was so oppressive that even the cicadas had ceased their singing, Silas did something strange. He knelt on the gravel, wrapped his arms around the gnarled trunk, and pressed his ear firmly against the wood. He didn't know what he was listening for. Perhaps he expected to hear the ants marching inside. Perhaps he hoped for a magical voice, like in the old fables the merchants told. At first, he heard only the rushing of his own blood in his ears, a dull thump, thump, thump that sounded like distant drums. He heard the friction of his coarse hair against the bark. But then, as he held his breath and let his mind settle into the deepest kind of quiet, the sounds of his own body faded. He began to imagine, or perhaps he began to hear. It was a sound so faint it might have been a vibration. It was a low, steady hum, like the sound of a finger circling the rim of a crystal glass, but deeper, much deeper. It was the sound of the sap. Silas closed his eyes tight. In the darkness of his mind, he saw the inside of the tree. He saw it not as dead grey wood, but as a bustling city of tubes and vessels, a microscopic network of rivers flowing upward against gravity. He imagined the water he'd poured the night before, the dirty, travel-stained water from the basin. He saw it being pulled from the dark soil, filtered through the sponge of the roots, stripped of its dust and impurity. He saw it climbing. It travelled up the twisted spine of the trunk, navigating the knots and the scars, pushing higher and higher. It was a laborious journey. The tree was working. While the rest of Jericho slept in the afternoon shade, Barnabas was lifting the weight of the water, carrying it like a heavy stone up a mountain, all to feed that one tiny green bud on the branch. "You are strong," Silas whispered into the wood. "You are stronger than the horses." He pulled back and looked at the bud. It had grown since the day the spider arrived. It was no longer a bump, it was unfurling. A sliver of pale, tender green was visible. Peeking out from the protective brown sheath, Silas touched it with extreme caution. It was soft, vulnerable. A single harsh wind could snap it. A bird could peck it away. "I am listening to you," Silas told the bud. "I can hear you drinking." He realised then that the tree had a rhythm, just like the household of Eliphaz. But while the household's rhythm was frantic, shouting, running, clanging, the tree's rhythm was slow and majestic. It was the rhythm of patience. It took a whole day to move a drop of water an inch. It took a week to open a leaf. It was a lesson Silas desperately needed. In his life as a servant, speed was everything. Hurry, boy. Run, boy. Faster, boy. Those were the words that ruled his existence. But here, with his ear against the bark, Barnabas taught him the holiness of slowness. Grow slowly, the tree seemed to say. Deepen your roots before you show your leaves. Do not rush the season. Silas sighed. A long exhale that emptied his lungs of the kitchen smoke and filled them with the scent of sun-baked wood. He looked at the spiderweb above him. The spider was gone, hiding from the heat, but the web remained, tattered now by the wind, yet still holding its shape. "We're all waiting," Silas said. He felt a change in the air. Not a temperature change, it was still scorching, but a change in the atmosphere. The sky had turned a bleached, blinding white. The birds were flying low, the smell of the dust was sharper, more metallic. The real summer was coming, the season of the east wind, the dreaded sharav. The dry heat that sucked the moisture out of plums and turned grapes into raisins on the vine was approaching. Silas looked at the tiny green bud. It looked so brave and so foolish. How could it survive the furnace that was coming? He pressed his hand over the bud, forming a cup with his palm to shield it from the sun for just a moment. "I will not let the sun burn you," he vowed. "I will bring you the night." He didn't know yet what that meant. He didn't know that his routine was about to be broken, that the rules of the house were about to tighten like a noose. He only knew that the whisper he heard inside the tree, that faint, stubborn hum of rising life, was the most important sound in the world. He stood up, his knees dusted with white powder. He patted the trunk. "Keep climbing," he whispered to the sap. "I am going to get more." He turned back to the house. The shadows were lengthening again. The cycle continued. But Silas walked with a new gravity. He carried the secret of the tree's heartbeat in his own chest. He walked slower now, matching his pace to the rhythm of the sap, moving with the quiet dignity of a boy who knows that the most important work in the world is invisible to the eye. The change began not with a sound, but with a colour. For weeks, the sky over Jericho had been a relentless, piercing blue, the colour of a king's robe. But on the morning of the seventh day, Silas woke to find the world bathed in a strange, sickly light. The blue was gone. In its place was a haze of pale, sulphurous yellow, like the colour of old parchment that has been left too long in the sun. The air, usually moving in gentle currents from the distant sea, had stopped. It hung heavy and motionless, suspended over the city. Then the wind turned. It did not come from the west, bringing the cool, salty promise of the Mediterranean. It came from the east. It came from the vast, baking emptiness of the Arabian wilderness. It was the sharav, the heat wind. To the people of the city, it felt as though someone had opened the door of a great oven. The heat was not radiant, it was aggressive. It carried with it a fine, microscopic dust that tasted of copper and ancient flint. It settled in the back of the throat, coated the eyelashes, and turned the smooth marble floors of Eliphaz's estate into gritty sandpaper. The household went into a state of siege. "Close the shutters," the steward bellowed, his voice cracking in the dry air. "Hang the wet linens! Seal the jars!" Silas watched the frantic preparations from his corner. He saw the maids dipping heavy wool sheets into the cisterns and hanging them over the open windows, hoping the evaporation would cool the air inside. The house of Eliphaz was turning inward, curling up like a beetle protecting its soft underbelly. But Silas could not curl up. His work was in the courtyards, in the dust. He wrapped his headcloth tighter around his face, leaving only a slit for his eyes, just as he'd seen the desert nomads do. He stepped out into the colonnade. The heat hit him with the physical force from through, pressing the air out of his lungs. It was a dry, sucking heat. He could feel the moisture on his skin evaporating the moment it appeared. Everything in the garden looked different in this yellow light. The pomegranate trees, usually so proud and glossy, looked dull and grey, their leaves drooping in surrender. The roses had closed their petals tight. Even the stone lions at the fountain seemed to be gasping. Silas's thoughts flew immediately to the dead corner. If the pampered roses of the main garden were suffering, what was happening to Barnabas? What was happening to the tiny brave bud that had just dared to peek out? He could not wait for evening. The rules of the house were strict, but the panic of the heat wind provided a cover. The overseers were too busy retreating to the cool inner cellars to notice a small boy slipping away. Silas moved through the shimmering air. The walk to the back of the estate felt twice as long as usual. The ground burned through the thin soles of his sandals. When he turned the final bend into the dead corner, his heart sank. The sanctuary looked like a battlefield. The heat here, trapped between the high stone walls, was intense. The air rippled and danced. The pile of broken tiles was too hot to touch. Silas ran to the tree. "Barnabas!" he croaked. His own throat was parched. The tree stood motionless. It did not rattle in the wind because the wind was a steady, heavy push rather than a gust. But the change was visible. The bark, which had begun to look healthier in the past weeks, now looked grey and brittle again. The damp circle of earth, the halo Silas had worked so hard to maintain, had vanished. The ground was baked white, cracked into a mosaic of thirsty fissures, and Goliath, the lizard, was gone, retreated deep into some deep crevice of the rocks, fleeing the surface temperature. The ants had disappeared underground. The web of the spider was empty, the silk threads sagging and brittle. Silas dropped to his knees, ignoring the sting of the hot gravel. He looked for the bud. There, on the low branch, was the single point of green. It had opened. In the face of the oncoming furnace, the stubborn life of the tree had pushed forward. A single leaf, no larger than a baby's fingernail, had unfurled. It was a bright, defiant emerald green, a shocking splash of colour in the monochrome world of dust. But it was in trouble. The edges of the tiny leaf were already curling. It looked limp, like a flag hanging on a windless day. The sun was pulling the life out of it faster than the roots could pump it up. "You shouldn't have come out today," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. He hovered his hand over the leaf, shading it. "It's too hot." He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness. This leaf was the firstborn. It was the proof that Barnabas was not a stick, but a living soul. If this leaf died, it would be as if the promise had been broken. Silas looked around desperately. There was no water here. He checked the sky. The sun was a pale disk behind the dust haze, indifferent and cruel. It was only mid-morning. There were hours and hours of burning light left before the sun would set. If he waited until evening to bring the basin water, the leaf would be crisp and dead. He had to do something now. He remembered the water jar in the servants' quarters. It was for drinking, strictly rationed during the heat waves. Taking from it was forbidden. To steal drinking water was a crime far worse than stealing dirty wash water. Silas looked at the leaf again. It seemed to be trembling, not from wind, but from exhaustion. He made a choice. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, hollowed-out gourd he used to carry smooth stones. He dumped the stones out. "Wait," he said to the tree. He ran back toward the house. He did not sneak this time. He moved with the urgency of a rescue party. He slipped into the cool, dark servants' hall. The clay water jar stood in the corner, covered with a wooden lid. Silas looked left and right. The room was empty. Everyone was asleep or working in the cellars. He lifted the lid. The water inside was cool and clear. He dipped his gourd. He took only a mouthful, a tiny amount, just enough to fill the small cup. He replaced the lid. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it would crack his ribs. He was a thief. He was stealing the life of the house. He ran back to the dead corner, shielding the open gourd with his hand to prevent evaporation. When he reached the tree, he didn't pour the water on the ground. The ground was too hot. It would steal the moisture before the roots could grab it. Instead, Silas did something tender. He dipped his finger into the gourd. A single drop of clear water clung to his fingertip. He touched the drop gently to the surface of the tiny leaf. The leaf accepted it. He traced the veins of the green skin with his wet finger, painting it with coolness. Then he poured the rest of the small gourd slowly, carefully, right at the base of the trunk where the roots were shallowest. "Hold on," Silas whispered. "The sun will go down. I promise." He sat there for a long time, using his own small body to cast a shadow over the leaf. He became a human parasol. The dust of the Sharav swirled around him, coating his hair and his tunic in yellow powder, turning him into a statue of the desert. He sat still, defying the sun, guarding the single green hope of the dead corner. He knew the heat wind would last for days. The siege had just begun. The Sharav did not leave. It settled over Jericho like an unwanted guest who refuses to depart, consuming the air and drinking the moisture from the walls. By the third day of the heat wind, the estate of Eliphaz had changed. The vibrant greens of the garden had dulled to the colour of olive drab. The stone pathways were coated in a film of yellow dust that reappeared moments after being swept. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was tense, like the silence of a held breath. In the centre of this stifling atmosphere stood Eliphaz the merchant. Silas, crouching behind a pillar in the lower colonnade, and watched the master of the house. Eliphaz was a man of heavy robes and heavy worries. Usually he moved with the confident stride of a man who owns everything his eyes can see. But today, his shoulders were slumped. He walked slowly along the edge of his prized pomegranate grove, inspecting the trees. The pomegranates were Eliphaz's pride. They were famous in Jericho for their size and the ruby-red sweetness of their seeds. But now the leaves were curling inward, showing their pale undersides in a gesture of surrender. The fruit, still young and green, looked small and hard. Eliphaz reached out and touched a drooping branch. He rubbed a dusty leaf between his thumb and forefinger. He frowned. To Eliphaz, a withered leaf was not a tragedy of nature. It was a leak in his treasury. Every dried fruit was a coin lost. "Jabin." Eliphaz's voice boomed through the heavy air, startling a dove from the rafters. The head gardener appeared from the shadows, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. He looked tired. The heat had aged him. "Master, the cistern," Eliphaz demanded, not looking at the servant but staring at the cloudless, hostile sky. "What is the level?" "We are down to the third mark, master," Jabin replied, his voice rough. "The lower springs are flowing slow." "The heat is drinking the pools faster than we can fill them." Eliphaz turned. His face was flushed, his eyes narrow. "The third mark? And the summer has only just begun." He began to pace, his sandals slapping angrily against the stone. Silas squeezed himself smaller into the shadow of the pillar. He knew this mood. It was the mood of a man who feels his control slipping away. "Call the household," Eliphaz ordered. "Everyone, from the steward to the sweepers, now." The bell was rung, a sharp, bronze sound that cut through the haze. Within minutes, the entire staff of the estate stood in the main courtyard. There were 20 of them in total. The cooks with flour on their aprons, the stable boys smelling of straw, the maids wringing their hands, and Silas standing at the very back, trying to look like part of the architecture. Eliphaz stood on the raised step of the portico. He looked down at them. The fountain behind him, usually a gurgling celebration of water, had been turned off. The silence of the water jets was terrifying. "Listen to me," Eliphaz began. His voice was low, but it carried to the corners of the yard. "The wind from the east is upon us. The wells of the city are straining. Jericho is thirsty." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "From this moment, the laws of this house are changed. Water is no longer a comfort. It is life. And it is my property." Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "There will be no more washing of the courtyards," Eliphaz decreed. "Let the dust sit. There will be no more baths for the servants. You will clean yourselves with oil and scrapers, or you will stay dirty." A murmur of dismay rippled through the line of women, but a sharp look from the steward silenced them. "And," Eliphaz continued, pointing a finger at the garden, "every drop of water that comes into this house belongs to the pomegranates and the vines. They are the livelihood of this estate. If they die, there is no harvest. If there is no harvest, there is no coin. If there is no coin, there is no food for you." He took a step forward, his eyes scanning the faces of his servants. "The basins," he said. Silas stopped breathing. "The water used for the washing of feet," Eliphaz said, his voice practical and cold. "I have seen it thrown into the gutters. This ends today. From now on, every basin, every cup, every drop of grey water must be collected. It will be poured into the irrigation channels for the fruit trees. Nothing is to be thrown out. Nothing is to be taken elsewhere." The command hung in the air like smoke. "If I catch anyone wasting water," Eliphaz said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout, "or using water for anything other than my orders, they will be cast out of the gate. And in this heat, the gate is a death sentence." He clapped his hands once. "Go, save my garden." The gathering dispersed. The servants hurried away, their faces grave, whispering to one another about the harshness of the new rules. Silas remained frozen for a moment. The decree was a catastrophe. Eliphaz had unknowingly severed the lifeline of the dead corner. The dirty water, the waste that Silas had been stealing, was no longer waste. It was now a precious resource claimed by the master. If Silas took the water from the basins now, he wasn't just salvaging trash. He was stealing from the pomegranates. He was stealing directly from Eliphaz's pocket. And the punishment was exile. Silas walked slowly back toward the servants' quarters. The heat seemed to have doubled. The air felt thick enough to choke on. He thought of Barnabas. He thought of the single, brave green leaf that he'd cooled with his own saliva in a stolen cup of drinking water just that morning. How long could the tree survive without him? A day? 2? The pomegranates were big trees. They had deep roots. They had been watered for years. They were fat and spoiled. They could survive a little thirst. But Barnabas was a recovering invalid. He was just learning how to live again. To cut off his water now, just as he had pushed out a leaf, was murder. Silas reached the kitchen courtyard. He saw the steward setting up a large clay barrel near the entrance. "All basin water goes in here," the steward shouted to the staff. "Jabin will collect it at sundown for the orchard." The system was airtight. There would be no leftover basins sitting in the shadows, and every drop was accounted for. Silas went to the broom closet and picked up his broom. He went to his duties, sweeping the dust that Eliphaz had said didn't matter anymore. He worked mechanically, his arms moving back and forth, swish, swish. But his mind was racing. He was a small boy. He had no power. He had no authority. He couldn't fight Eliphaz. But as he swept near the gate, he looked out at the street. He saw a beggar sitting in the dust, holding an empty cup. He saw a dog panting in the shade of a wall, its tongue lolling out. "Water is for the living," Eliphaz had said. But Eliphaz only considered things that made money to be living. Silas thought of the spider web. He thought of Goliath the lizard. He thought of the whisper of the sap he'd heard inside the trunk. "They are living too," Silas thought fiercely. He looked at his own hands. They were empty. He had no bucket. He had no access to the well. He had no access to the basins. But he had himself. A dangerous idea began to form in Silas's mind. It was a math of sacrifice. Every servant was given a ration, 1 small jug of water per day for drinking. It was barely enough to keep a throat moist in this weather. It was the difference between dizziness and fainting. Silas looked at the sun, burning high and white above the walls. He licked his dry lips. If he didn't drink his ration, if he saved half, no, if he saved most of it, it would be a torment. His body would scream, his head would ache, the heat would try to crush him, but Barnabas would get a drink. It was a quiet rebellion. It was a secret war against the economics of Eliphaz. The master said water belonged to the pomegranates. Silas decided that his water, the water that belonged to his own blood and body, belonged to the dead corner. He gripped his broom tighter. The fear of Eliphaz remained, heavy and dark. But beneath the fear, something else was rising. It was the same stubbornness he'd felt in the tree roots. He would not let the green leaf die, not while he still had spit in his mouth and blood in his veins. The siege was on. The sun finally set on the 4th day of the Sharav, but it did not take the heat with it. Usually, the desert night is a mercy. As soon as the light fails, the earth exhales the day's fire and breathes in the cool breath of the stars. But during a heat wind, the night is merely a darker version of the day. The air remains heavy, thick, and suffocating, like a wool blanket pulled over the head of a feverish child. In the main courtyards of Eliphaz's estate, a silent tragedy was unfolding. Silas, moving like the shadow through the colonnade, clutched his small clay water jug against his chest. It was his daily ration. He had taken only 3 small sips since dawn. His tongue felt like a dry leaf in his mouth. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache behind his eyes. But he was watching the pomegranates. Despite Eliphaz's decree, despite the gallons of grey washwater poured into the irrigation channels, the great orchard was suffering. The water didn't seem to help. The earth was so hot, so baked by the relentless wind, that the water simply sat on the surface for a moment before evaporating into the hungry air. It was as if the ground had forgotten how to drink. Silas saw the leaves of the prize trees. In the moonlight, they looked silver and ghostly. They were curled tight, brittle to the touch. The unripened fruit hung heavy and limp, their skins beginning to wrinkle. The garden of Eliphaz was a place of abundance, pampered for years with the best manure and the most consistent watering. But it was a fragile abundance. These trees had never known thirst. They had shallow roots because they had never needed to search for water. The moment the easy supply was threatened, the moment the air turned hostile, they panicked. They had no memory of survival. Silas turned away from the dying luxury and slipped into the darkness of the service corridor. He navigated the familiar path to the back of the estate. The stone walls radiated heat against his shoulder. The dust on the floor was warm under his sandals. When he reached the dead corner, the silence was absolute. Even the crickets had ceased their song. It was too hot to sing. Silas approached the pile of rubble. He moved slowly, conserving every ounce of energy. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, and he had to steady himself against a boulder. "I am here," he croaked. His voice was a rasp, barely a sound. He looked at Barnabas. The tree stood in the gloom, a dark, twisted shape against the starless haze. It looked battered. The bark was grey and dusty. The spiderweb was gone. The spider had likely retreated into a deep crevice to wait out the siege. The ants were nowhere to be seen, but the tree was standing, and there, on the low branch, the single green leaf was still there. It was drooping, yes, it was limp, but it was not brown. It was not dead. Silas sank to his knees. The movement made the water in his jug slosh. The sound was torture. It was the most beautiful sound in the world, the sound of liquid. His body screamed at him. "Drink it," his instinct shouted. "It is yours. You earned it. You are the boy. The tree is just wood. Drink. He lifted the jug. The rim was cool. He could smell the water, a clean, wet scent that made his mouth water in a painful reflex. He brought it to his lips. He closed his eyes. He imagined the cool slide of the water down his parched throat. He imagined the relief spreading through his chest, cooling his blood. One swallow. Just one swallow. He tilted the jug. The water touched his lower lip. Then he stopped. He opened his eyes and looked at the leaf. In the darkness, it looked like a small, folded hand. If he drank, the headache would go away for an hour, but tomorrow the sun would rise again. And by noon, without this water, the leaf would turn to dust. The root would retract. The promise would be broken. Barnabas had fought for years in this corner alone without help. He had pushed his roots through rock. He had waited. I'm not a pomegranate, Silas thought fiercely. I'm not soft. I can wait. He pulled the jug away from his mouth. He licked the single drop that had wet his lip, a tiny, momentary relief, and then lowered the vessel to the ground. For you, he whispered. He poured. He didn't pour it all at once. He poured it in a thin, steady stream, right at the base of the trunk, directly over the main root. He watched the dry earth darken. He watched the water vanish instantly into the soil, rushing down to the secret places where the life was hiding. He poured until the jug was empty. He shook the last drop out. Then, he did something else. He lay down on the ground, curling his body around the base of the tree. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, but he didn't care. We will sleep now, he told the tree. He was dizzy with thirst, but his heart felt strangely full. He looked over at the wall where the main garden lay. He knew that just 100 yards away. Eliphaz was likely pacing his bedroom, unable to sleep, worrying about his dying fortune. Eliphaz had cisterns full of water, yet he was tormented by loss. Silas had nothing, and his cup was empty, and his throat was dry. And yet, lying there in the dust with his arm thrown over the roots of a crippled tree, he felt a strange, deep peace. He was a guardian. And there was a mystery here, one that Silas was just beginning to understand. The pomegranates in the main garden were dying because they were trying to keep all their leaves, all their fruit, all their glory. They were trying to maintain an image of abundance in a time of scarcity. But Barnabas was humble. He had only one leaf. He wasn't trying to be a big tree. He was focusing all his energy, all his strength, on that one small point of life. Focus on the small thing, Silas thought as his eyes grew heavy. Do not try to save the whole world. Just save the leaf. The heat pressed down on him, but sleep came anyway. It was a heavy, dreamless sleep, earned by sacrifice. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, when the constellation of Orion had wheeled overhead, a small thing happened. The roots of the fig tree, emboldened by the gift of the water, pushed a fraction of an inch deeper into the dark. They were not just drinking, they were searching. They were sensing the vibration of something far below, something that the pampered roots of the pomegranates could never reach. And above ground, in the silence of the dead corner, the single green leaf lifted its head just a little, turning its face toward the east, waiting for the dawn. Silas slept on, his breathing shallow and quiet, unaware that he was lying on top of a miracle waiting to break. By the 6th day of the Sharav, the boundary between the boy and the world began to dissolve. Thirst is a strange architect. It dismantles the walls of the mind, brick by brick. At first, it is a physical pain, a dry throat, a cracked lip. But as the days press on under the relentless hammer of the sun, thirst becomes a lens. It warps the air. It stretches time. It turns the solid stone of Jericho into something fluid and wavering. Silas moved through his duties like a sleepwalker. The broom in his hands felt as light as a feather, then as heavy as a lead bar. The voices of the other servants sounded distant, as if they were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. Boy, sweep the steps. The The words floated by him. Unanchored. Silas nodded. But he wasn't looking at the steps. He was looking at the air. He could see the heat now. It wasn't just invisible warmth, it was a shimmering, gelatinous substance that vibrated above the cobblestones. It looked like the ghosts of water, dancing and mocking him. His ration jug was empty. He had given the last of it to Barnabas the night before. Now, his own body was beginning to consume itself. His tongue felt too large for his mouth, a dry, rough sponge that tasted of iron. His skin had stopped sweating. It was hot and dry to the touch, like parchment paper. When the midday rest was called, Silas did not go to the servants' quarters to lie on his mat. The air in there was stale, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. Instead, he drifted toward the dead corner. The journey felt endless. The corridor seemed to stretch out, the walls elongating. Silas felt as though he were walking on the bottom of a dry ocean. When he finally reached the sanctuary, the sun was at its zenith. The light was blinding, a white, bleaching glare that erased all shadows. He found Barnabas. The tree looked terrible. The single green leaf, the brave emerald flag that Silas had fought so hard to save, was now limp and grey. It hung from the branch by a thread, twisting slowly in the hot breath of the wind. The bark of the trunk had paled, looking more like bone than wood. Silas collapsed onto his knees. The gravel dug into his skin, but the pain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. "I'm sorry," he rasped. No sound came out. His voice was gone. He crawled closer, dragging his body until he was curled up against the base of the trunk. He closed his eyes against the glare. And then the world shifted. As his eyelids shut, the darkness didn't come. Instead, a strange, sepia-toned vision bloomed in his mind. The ground beneath him seemed to turn transparent, like glass. He could see down. He saw the earth not as a solid block of dirt, but as a vast, dark, intricate lattice. And he saw the roots of Barnabas. They were not dead wood. They were alive. They were vibrant, pulsing chords of desperate energy. They looked like the veins in his own wrist, blue and thrumming. He saw them twisting through the suffocating darkness of the soil, pushing past sharp rocks, squeezing through layers of hard clay. In his delirium, Silas could feel what the roots felt. He felt the abrasion of the stone. He felt the crushing weight of the earth. And above all, he felt the thirst. It wasn't just a desire for water. It was a screaming, cellular panic. It was a vacuum, a void demanding to be filled. Thump, thump, thump. Was that his heart? Or the trees? Deeper. Silas didn't know if he spoke the word or if the tree whispered it into his bones. Deeper. There is nothing here. Go deeper. In his mind's eye, he saw the main taproot, the thickest, strongest part of the tree, driving downward with the force of a spear. It was a blind, frantic dive into the unknown. It was bypassing the dry layers where the pomegranate roots lay dying. It was seeking the ancient memory of water. Silas opened his eyes, gasping. The vision vanished. The blinding white reality of the dead corner returned. He was trembling. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the trunk. The wood was hot, burning hot. "You are burning," Silas whispered. He looked at his empty hands. He had no water. He had no spit. He had nothing. He looked around wildly. His eyes landed on a rag he had tucked into his belt, a piece of coarse linen he used to wipe sweat. He pulled it out. It was bone dry. He looked at the rocks. He looked at the sky. There was no cloud, no mercy. A tear formed in the corner of his eye, a miracle of physiology, the body squeezing out its last reserve of moisture for grief. Silas caught the tear on his finger. It was tiny, salty, insignificant. He pressed his finger against the dying leaf. "One drop," he murmured. Don't let go." He lay back down, his cheek pressed against the roots. The heat from the ground seeped into his face. He felt a strange sensation of merging. He was no longer Silas the orphan boy. He was part of the root system. His legs were the branches. His torso was the trunk. His thirst was the tree's thirst. If the tree died, he would die. It was a simple fact. They were tethered together in this oven. He started to dream again, a waking dream. He dreamed of a river. Not the muddy Jordan, but a river of clear, cold glass. It was flowing right beneath him, just inches away, separated by a thin sheet of rock. He could hear it. Burble, rush, splash. The sound was maddening. It was so close. "Can you hear it, Barnabas?" he asked the silence. "It's singing." He scratched at the hard earth with his fingernails. He wanted to dig. He wanted to tear the ground open with his bare hands and find the river. But his fingers were weak. He only managed to scrape away a layer of dust. His hand fell limp. The sun beat down. The wind hissed through the cracks in the wall. Silas lay suspended in the amber of the afternoon. He was waiting for the end, or waiting for the rain that would never come. He didn't know that he was right. He didn't know that his fever dream was not a lie. There was a river, or at least a vein of the deep earth's blood, trapped under the limestone cap, under high pressure, waiting for a key to turn the lock. But Silas had no key. He only had his weight, pressing down on the earth, offering his company to a dying friend. "I won't leave," he whispered into the dirt. "I'll stay until the rain comes." His breathing grew shallow. The world faded into a buzzing white noise. The boy and the tree lay together in the dead corner, two specks of stubborn life in a city that was slowly turning to dust, and deep below them, in the cool, crushing dark, the taproot of Barnabas pushed 1 millimetre further. It hit the surface of the limestone plate. It did not stop. It began to bore. The sun did not set gently that evening. It collapsed behind the Judean hills like a weary fighter, leaving the sky bruised in shades of violet and charcoal. Silas woke from his stupor with a start. The air had cooled, but only slightly. It was the difference between being in a fire and being in the ashes. The heat was still there, radiating from every stone and wall, but the blinding glare was gone. His throat felt like it was lined with wool. His tongue was a foreign object, swollen and clumsy. It was time for the evening ration. He pulled himself up from the gravel of the dead corner. His legs trembled, weak as newborn colts. He had to lean against the wall to steady the spinning world. One foot, then the other. He navigated the corridor back to the servants' courtyard by muscle memory alone. The scene at the water barrel was sombre. The steward stood guard with a ladle, measuring out the portions with the strict precision of a chemist. There was no talking. The other servants lined up, their eyes fixed on the dark, reflective surface of the water in the barrel. When it was Silas's turn, he held out his cup, a small chipped earthenware vessel that held perhaps half a pint. The steward dipped the ladle. Splash. The sound was agonizingly beautiful. The clear liquid filled the cup. "Drink slowly, boy," the steward muttered through his voice raspy. "Don't vomit it back up." Silas stared at the water. It was trembling in the cup, catching the light of the torches. It looked like liquid silver. He could smell it, a clean mineral scent that cut through the dust in his nose. His body screamed. Every instinct he possessed, every cell in his biology shouted a single command: drink, lift it to your lips, swallow, live. His hand began to rise toward his mouth automatically. His lips parted. He stopped. The image of the single green leaf, curled and grey, flashed in his mind. He remembered the feeling of the dry roots vibrating against his cheek. He remembered the dream of the underground river. If he drank this cup, he would live another day. He would sweep the floors. He would be invisible, but Barnabas would die tonight. He knew it with a chilling certainty. The tree had reached its limit. It had used its last reserve of energy to push out that leaf, trusting that water would come. If tonight was dry, the sap would harden, the capillaries would collapse, and the sleeping giant would never wake up. Silas lowered the cup. He looked around. The other servants were busy gulping their shares, eyes closed in ecstasy. No one was watching the sweeper boy. He took a breath. The air tasted of dust. He turned and walked away. The journey back to the dead corner was a pilgrimage of pain. The cup was heavy in his hands. The water sloshed gently, a siren song tempting him with every step. Just one sip, the voice in his head whispered. Just wet your tongue. The tree won't know. He bit the inside of his cheek. The sharp pain focused him. No, he hissed through his teeth. He walked past the kitchen, where the smell of stale bread made his stomach cramp. He walked past the main garden, where the pomegranate trees stood like ghosts in the gloom. When he reached the sanctuary, the moon had risen, a thin, sharp crescent that looked like a sickle. Silas approached the tree. It looked worse than he remembered. In the pale moonlight, the leaf hung straight down, brittle and motionless. The trunk seemed to have shrunk, the bark pulling tight against the wood. Silas knelt. He set the cup down on the flat rock. He looked at the water. He looked at the tree. This was the math of the desert. One life for another. I brought it, Silas whispered. His voice was a dry croak. He picked up the cup. His hands were shaking so badly that a few drops spilled onto his knuckles. He stared at the wetness on his skin, fighting the urge to lick it off. He leaned forward. He placed the rim of the cup against the base of the trunk, right where the main root disappeared into the earth. Drink, he commanded. He tipped the cup. The water didn't rush out. It poured in a smooth, silent glug. It hit the parched earth and vanished instantly, as if the ground were a mouth pulled wide open. Silas watched the level of the water in the cup go down. Half gone. 3/4 gone. His own throat convulsed. A dry sob racked his chest. It was a physical act of violence to pour this water away. It went against everything his body needed. It felt like he was bleeding himself dry. Empty. He held the cup upside down. The last drop fell. Plink. The dark stain on the earth was small, pitifully small against the vast dryness of the night. But it was there. Silas sat back, dropping the empty cup. He felt lightheaded. The edges of his vision were starting to blur again. He reached out and touched the trunk. That was me, he whispered to the tree. That water was me. He didn't know the theology of what he'd just done. He didn't know the stories of old sacrifices or poured out offerings. He only knew that he felt lighter, hollowed out. Yes, but clean. He lay down on the gravel, his head spinning. He was too weak to walk back to the servants' quarters. He would sleep here tonight. As he drifted into the grey fog of exhaustion, he looked up at the moon. I gave you everything, he mumbled. Now you have to fight. Silence settled over the dead corner. The boy lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms. The empty cup lay on its side, a testament to the foolishness of love. And in the dark, wet earth beneath the boy, the water began its work. It was a small amount, barely a mouthful for a human, but for a root system that had learned to hoard every molecule. It was a flood. The water was absorbed. It travelled into the root hairs. It moved into the xylem. The vibration began again. Deep, deep down, past the rock, past the clay, past the memory of the surface world, the tip of the taproot received the signal. It surged. It stiffened. It pushed. Crack. It was a sound too small for human ears, occurring 20 feet underground, but it was the sound of victory. The tip of the root had found a hairline fracture in the limestone cap. It wedged itself in. It expanded. Silas slept on, unaware that beneath him, The geology of Jericho was beginning to yield to the biology of a boy's sacrifice. The sleep that claimed Silas was not the gentle, restoring slumber of a child. It was a heavy, dark gravity that pulled him down through the layers of consciousness, past the hunger, past the thirst, dragging him deep into the geology of his own exhaustion. He was no longer lying on the sharp gravel of the dead corner. In the strange alchemy of his delirium, the ground beneath him softened. It did not become a pillow, it became a portal. Silas felt himself sinking. He sank through the dusty surface layer where the ants slept in their tunnels. He sank through the compacted clay, cool and dense against his skin. He sank past the shards of broken pottery, the history of Jericho's mistakes, and into the true, ancient earth. He was dreaming, but it was a dream with the texture of reality. He was not watching a story, he was becoming part of the landscape. In this subterranean world, there was no light, yet Silas could see. He saw with a sense that wasn't vision, a kind of seismic awareness. He saw the strata of the earth stacked like the pages of a heavy stone book. He saw layers of white limestone, layers of red sandstone, layers of grey flint, and running through it all, like a desperate, thrumming nerve, was the root of Barnabas. Silas was no longer separate from the tree. He was the root. He felt the wood of the root as if it were his own bone. He felt the bark as his own skin. And most intensely, he felt the pressure. He was 20 feet underground, surrounded by the crushing weight of the world. The darkness here was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of stone. But there was a drive in him, a fierce biological imperative that pushed him forward. Down. Must go down. He felt the water he had poured earlier, the cup of his own sacrifice. It wasn't a drink, it was a weapon. The water had slicked the sides of the root, greasing the passage through the tight, suffocating clay. It gave him the slip and slide he needed to move. But now, he had hit the barrier. In his dream, the barrier appeared as a vast white floor that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was the bedrock, the hard place. It was cold, indifferent, and impenetrable. Silas pushed against it with his shoulder, or was it the root tip pushing? He couldn't tell. The pain was sharp and blinding, blossoming behind his eyes. "Let me in," he screamed without a mouth. "I'm thirsty." The rock did not answer. The rock was silent, solidified. Silas felt the despair of the tree. This was where the ancestors of Barnabas had died. This was the graveyard of roots. To hit the bedrock was to hit the end of the world. But then, in the silence of the dream, he heard it. It was the sound he had hallucinated earlier, but now it was louder. It was a low, assonant vibration that hummed through the stone floor. Thrum, thrum. It was the song of the deep waters. It was the voice of the Tehom, the great abyss of water that lay trapped beneath the crust of the earth, waiting for a doorway. It was so close. Silas could feel the coldness of it radiating through the rock, taunting his feverish skin. It was separated from him by only inches of limestone. In the logic of the dream, Silas realised what he had to do. He couldn't ask the rock to move. He couldn't wait for a door to open. He had to become a drill. He gathered himself. He gathered the memory of the wind, the memory of the sun, the memory of the dirty water from the traveller's feet. He gathered the love of the spider and the patience of the lizard. He focused everything into a single point, the very tip of the root. Push. The sensation was agonizing. It felt as though his head were being squeezed in a vice. He ground his face into the dirt of the dead corner, moaning in his sleep, his small hands clawing at the gravel. Underground, the root twisted. It found the microscopic hairline fracture, a tiny weakness in the armour of the stone that the water had softened. It wedged itself in. Push. The rock groaned. It was a sound like grinding teeth. Silas sweated in his sleep. His body was burning up, his temperature rising as the struggle intensified. He was fighting the battle of physics on behalf of a tree that could not move. Just a little more. Just one more inch. The vibration of the water grew louder. It sounded like a rushing wind now. It sounded like rain on a tin roof. It called to him, "Come here. Come drink. Come rest." With a final wrenching effort that seemed to tear the very fibres of his being, Silas felt a pop. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the subtle, terrifying give of structure failure. The tip of the root broke through the bottom of the limestone plate. And then, bliss. The tip of the root dangled into open space. Darkness. Cool, damp, airy darkness. And below it, just touching the hair-thin fibres, was the surface of the underground river. The shock of the cold was electric. Silas gasped in the real world, his back arching off the gravel. In the dream, the water rushed into the root. It wasn't like the muddy basin water. It was pure. It was ancient. It tasted of diamonds and ice. It rushed up the root system with the force of a geyser. It flooded the dry veins. It washed away the dust. It cooled the burning fever of the wood. It was life, distilled. Silas felt the relief wash over him like a wave. The pain in his head vanished. The weight of the earth lifted. He was floating now, buoyed by the current of the hidden spring. "I found it," he whispered in his sleep. "Barnabas, I found it." The dream began to fade, dissolving into the grey mist of dawn. The sensation of being a root receded, leaving him back in the small, fragile body of a starving boy. But the feeling remained. A connection had been made. A circuit had been closed. Silas opened his eyes. The sky above him was a pale, washed-out grey. The sun had not yet risen, but the heat of the coming day was already lurking on the horizon. He was stiff. His mouth was so dry it felt glued shut. His head swam with dizziness as he tried to sit up. He looked at his hands. They were caked in dust, the fingernails broken and dirty from clawing at the ground in his sleep. He turned slowly to look at the tree. He expected to see a skeleton. He expected to see the brown, crumpled remains of the single leaf lying on the ground. But the leaf was there. It was still hanging from the branch. And was it his imagination? Was it the lingering hallucination of the dream? The leaf did not look limp. It looked turgid. It was holding itself up, the stem firm and curved. The colour was not the grey of death, but a deep, dark green. And on the tip of the leaf, defying the bone-dry air of the Sharav, defying the drought of Jericho, hung a single perfect drop of water. Dew? Impossible. The air was too dry for dew. Silas leaned closer, his eyes wide. It was guttation. The tree was pumping water. Silas touched the drop. It was cool. He looked down at the base of the trunk. The earth was dry on the surface, cracked and white. There was no sign of the water he'd poured the night before. But the tree knew. Silas slumped back against the wall, a weak, cracked smile breaking across his face. He didn't know how. He didn't know about the limestone plate or the underground cavern. He only knew that Barnabas was drinking. "You thief," Silas whispered affectionately, his voice a wreck. "You found the cellar." He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to savour the victory. He was thirsty. He was starving. He was in danger of being punished if he didn't get back to his sweeping. But for this one moment, in the quiet dawn of the dead corner, Silas was the richest boy in Jericho. He sat in the presence of a miracle that no one else could see. The giant had woken up. The morning sun rose with the violence of a drawn sword. The Sharav had entered its second week, and Jericho was no longer a city. It was a kiln. The air didn't just carry heat, it carried a silence so heavy that it pressed against the eardrums. Birds had stopped flying. Dogs had stopped barking. Even the flies seemed to have fallen from the air, desiccated on the windowsills. Silas pulled himself up from the gravel of the dead corner. His body felt light, dangerously light, as if his bones had been hollowed out like a bird's. He had to grab the rough stones of the wall to keep from floating away. He looked at his hands. His skin was dusted with a fine, white powder, making him look like a phantom. He tried to lick his lips, but his tongue found no moisture. It scraped against the roof of his mouth like sandpaper. He turned to the tree. In the brutal light of the morning, the change was undeniable. Yesterday, Barnabas had been a desperate invalid, clinging to life by a thread. Today, the tree possessed a strange, quiet solidity. It wasn't that it had suddenly grown branches or burst into bloom. It was still a twisted, gnarled stump to the naked eye. But the presence of it had shifted. Silas reached out a trembling hand to touch the trunk. He expected the wood to be burning hot, baking in the morning sun like the rocks around it. He gasped. The bark was cool. It was a startling sensation, a physical anomaly in the oven of the corner. Under his fingertips, the rough grey skin of the tree felt filled. Before, the bark had been brittle, flaking off at the slightest touch, covering dry, dead wood. Now, it felt tight. It felt tense. It was the feeling of a water skin that has been filled to the brim. Silas pressed his cheek against the rough surface. He closed his eyes, letting the inexplicable coolness seep into his feverish skin. It was the only cold thing in the entire estate. "You found it," Silas whispered, Russ, his voice a cracked ruin. "You really found it." He traced the deep fissures in the bark. They looked like canyons on a map. But inside those canyons, the wood was no longer pale and dusty. It was dark. It was drinking. Silas stepped back. He looked at the single leaf. It stood proud and firm, facing the sun without fear. And near the base of the leaf stem, Silas saw something else. A tiny, green swelling. Another bud. The tree was not just surviving the drought, it was defying it. While the rest of the world was shrinking, curling up and dying, Barnabas was expanding. A sudden wave of dizziness hit Silas. The world tilted on its axis. Black spots danced in his vision. He stumbled, catching himself on the pile of broken roof tiles. The sharp edge of a shard cut his palm, but he barely felt it. He had to get to work. If he didn't appear in the main courtyard, the steward would come looking. And if they found him here, in this forbidden state of exhaustion, they might ask questions. Silas straightened his tunic. He rubbed his cheeks to bring some colour back into them, though it was useless. He looked at the tree one last time. "You don't need me anymore," he realised. The thought was a mixture of relief and a sudden, sharp loneliness. He had been the provider. He had been the rain god of the dead corner. Now, the tree had tapped into a source far greater than a boy's stolen cup. Barnabas was independent. Silas turned and began the long, wavering walk back to the house. The main garden of Eliphaz was a graveyard of ambition. As Silas passed through the archway, the smell hit him. Not the sweet scent of jasmine, but the acrid, sour smell of fermenting sap and decaying leaves. The great pomegranate orchard was in full retreat. The ground was littered with fallen leaves, creating a carpet of brittle brown that crunched under Silas's sandals. The irrigation channels, which Eliphaz had ordered filled with the washwater, were dry trenches of mud. The water had evaporated before it could do any good. Silas stopped by one of the prize pomegranate trees. It was a massive thing, its trunk as thick as a barrel. But it looked defeated. Its branches drooped low, heavy with the weight of dying wood. The fruit, once the promise of wealth, hung shriveled and hard, like leather balls. He touched the bark of the pomegranate. It was hot. Hot and dry. It felt like touching a corpse. "You have everything," Silas thought, looking at the intricate system of channels and the rich and manured soil. "But you have no secret." These trees lived on the surface. They waited for the water to come to them. They waited for the gardener, for the sky, for the master. They had never learned the lesson of the rock. They had never learned to dig. Silas felt a strange pity for the giants. They were dying of privilege. "Boy!" The shout cracked like a whip. Silas jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. The steward stood on the terrace steps. He looked haggard, his eyes rimmed with red dust. The heat had made everyone cruel. "Why are you standing there staring at the air?" the steward barked. "The dust is an inch thick on the colonnade. Sweep!" Silas bowed his head. "Yes, sir." He hurried to the broom closet. His body protested with every step. His muscles felt like they were made of sand. When he picked up the broom, his grip was weak. He began to sweep. Swish, swish. The rhythm usually calmed him, but today it was a torment. The dust he swept up swirled into the air, clogging his nose, coating his dry throat. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that tore at his chest. He looked at the water barrel in the corner. It was guarded. Of course. He swept past it. He could smell the water. It was a torture designed by demons. "I gave my cup away," he reminded himself. "I bought the life of the tree." But his body didn't care about the noble sacrifice. His body wanted to live. As the morning wore on, Silas felt himself fading. He worked slower and slower. He leaned against the pillars more often. He saw the other servants looking at him. They didn't look with concern. They looked with suspicion. In a time of scarcity, weakness was dangerous. Weakness meant you were a burden. "You look sick," he heard one of the maids whisper. "Let him be," another replied. "If he falls, he falls. More water for us," Silas gritted his teeth. He would not fall. He possessed a secret strength, just like the tree. He had a root deep in the ground, even if no one could see it. By midday, the heat was a physical weight, pressing him down toward the floor. Silas sought refuge in the narrow strip of shade behind the kitchen. He slid down the wall, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes and tried to send his mind back to the dead corner. He tried to summon the feeling of the cool bark. It is cool there, he told himself. The water is rushing in the dark and it is bubbling up. He drifted into a half-sleep. The sounds of the kitchen, the chopping of onions, the clatter of pans, merging with the imaginary sound of the underground spring. He saw the rough bark of Barnabas in his mind. He saw the texture of it, rugged, scarred, ugly. Roughness is good, he thought dreamily. Smooth things die in the desert. Only the rough things can hold on. Eliphaz was smooth and his robes were silk. His hands were soft, and his world was collapsing. Silas rubbed his own arm. His skin was rough with dust and sun. He was like the tree. He was becoming bark. He didn't know how long he sat there. He was woken by the sound of heavy footsteps. It was Jabin, the head gardener. The big man stopped in front of Silas, blocking the sun. He cast a long shadow over the boy. Silas looked up, terrified. Had he been caught sleeping? Was he going to be thrown out? Jabin didn't shout. He looked down at Silas with a strange expression. It wasn't kindness, exactly, but it was a recognition of suffering. Jabin held a bucket in his hand. It was empty, smelling of mud. The master is in a rage, Jabin said quietly. He says the trees are dying because we're stealing the water. Silas held his breath. He wants the back corners checked, Jabin continued, staring at Silas. He thinks there might be leaks in the old walls. He thinks water is escaping. Silas felt his blood turn to ice. He told me to clear the rubble, Jabin said, shifting the bucket. Tomorrow, he wants the dead corner cleared out. He wants to see the foundations. The world stopped. Cleared? Silas whispered. Every stone, Jabin said, looking away, toward the dying orchard. Everything that isn't a wall must go. If there's a leak, we find it. If there's trash, we burn it. Jabin walked away, his heavy boots thudding on the stone. Silas sat frozen. The heat of the day was forgotten. The thirst was forgotten. Tomorrow, Jabin would bring the axes and the shovels. Tomorrow, they would march into the sanctuary. They would see the tree. They would see the inexplicable green leaf. They wouldn't see a miracle. They would see a thief. How could a tree be green when the orchard was dying? There was only one explanation in the mind of Eliphaz. The tree was stealing water. It was a parasite. And Eliphaz burned parasites. Silas scrambled to his feet. He swayed, catching himself on the wall. The rough stone scraped his palm. The secret was over. The silent growth in the dark, the cool bark, the hidden spring, it was all about to be exposed to the blinding, unforgiving justice of the master. Silas looked toward the back of the estate. He had to warn Barnabas. He had to do something. But what could a starving boy do against an army of gardeners with axes? He touched the rough skin of his own arm again. Hold on, he thought. We have to hold on for one more night. The night arrived not as a relief, but as a shroud. Jericho lay under the heavy blanket of the heat wind, breathless and waiting. In the estate of Eliphaz, the lamps were extinguished early. There was no oil to waste on light when the master was counting every copper coin. The house was a dark, brooding beast, its corridors filled with the shadows of anxiety. Silas did not sleep. How could he? He laid on his mat in the servants' quarters, listening to the shallow, restless breathing of the other workers. They dreamed of water. They dreamed of rain. Silas dreamed of axes. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Clear the rubble. Check the foundations. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. But the image of Jabin's heavy boots crushing the gravel of the dead corner would not leave him. He imagined the sound of metal striking wood, the sickening thwack that would sever the connection between the earth and the sky. He sat up. The air in the room was stale, recycling the misery of 20 thirsty bodies. He couldn't breathe here. He couldn't let Barnabas face the last night alone. He stood up, his movements silent and fluid, practiced over 100 nights of stealth. He was lighter now, physically diminished by the days of hunger and thirst. He felt less like a boy and more like a vapour, a ghost haunting the halls of the living. He drifted out into the courtyard. The moon was hidden behind the dust haze, turning the night into a murky, suffocating grey. Silas walked past the main garden. The silence coming from the pomegranate orchard was profound. It was the silence of a held breath. The great trees, usually so imposing, looked skeletal in the gloom. They were shedding their leaves in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The ground was littered with them, dry curling flakes that crunched under Silas's feet like eggshells. You are dying, Silas thought, looking at the giants. You're big and famous, but you are dying. He felt no triumph in this, only a deep sadness. The world was upside down. The rich were withering, and the poor, the secret poor, were drinking deep. He reached the narrow passage to the dead corner. The heat here was radiating from the stones, a stored memory of the sun's violence. Silas pushed through the heavy air, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He entered the sanctuary. It was exactly as he had left it, yet entirely different. The pile of broken tiles, the twisted metal, the jagged rocks, they were all there, ugly and discarded. But in the centre of the ruin, Barnabas stood with an eerie composure. Silas approached slowly. He was afraid. He was afraid that the magic had broken, that the connection he felt yesterday had been a delusion of his fever. But as he drew closer, he felt it. The air around the tree was different. It wasn't just a temperature difference anymore. It was a density. The tree was displacing the dry heat with its own atmosphere. Silas knelt. He reached out and touched the trunk. It was cold, cold as stone from a deep well, and it was vibrating. Not shaking, but humming with that internal hydraulic power. The sound of the sap rising was no longer a whisper. To Silas's heightened senses, it felt like a roar. The tree was gorging itself, down in the dark. The roots were drinking with the desperation of a survivor, who has found the only water source in the world. You don't know, do you? Silas whispered, his voice trembling. He leaned his forehead against the cool bark. You think you won, he said. You think because you found the water, you're safe? The tree stood silent, confident in its secret success. They're coming tomorrow, Silas told the tree. He wanted the wood to understand. They're bringing the iron. They don't care about the water. They think you are trash. Tears pricked Silas's eyes, hot, stinging tears that had no business existing in such a dehydrated body. He felt a surge of irrational anger. Why was the world like this? Why did beauty have to hide in the garbage? Why did strength look so ugly? If Eliphaz knew, he would probably build a shrine here. He would sell the water. He would put a fence around Barnabas. But he didn't know. He only saw a dead corner. Silas slumped down, curling his body around the base of the trunk. He tried to make himself as small as possible, as if by covering the roots with his own ribs he could shield them from the morning. I can't stop them, Silas confessed to the darkness. I am just the sweeper. He felt useless. He had given his water, his sleep, his heart, and in the end, it wasn't enough against the brute force of authority. He looked up at the single leaf. In the darkness, it was a black flag of defiance. It was fully open now, broad and strong, and next to it, the second bud had split. A tiny, pale green curl was visible. Life was accelerating. The tree was rushing to grow, unaware that it was racing toward a finish line drawn by a gardener's axe. Silas closed his eyes. He felt the cold radiation of the tree against his back. It was the most comforting feeling in the world. It was the feeling of being held by something stronger than himself. Maybe I should run away, he thought. I could leave before dawn. I could go to the hills. But he knew he wouldn't. He was anchored here. He was the keeper of the hidden route. The keeper didn't leave his post just because the enemy was at the gate. I will stay, he whispered. He didn't know what good it would do. He wasn't big like Jabin. He wasn't powerful like Eliphaz. He was just a speed bump in their path. But he would be a speed bump. He settled into the dust. The exhaustion of the day, the weight of the despair, and the strange hypnotic hum of the tree began to pull him under. He drifted into a light, troubled sleep. He dreamed of the axe. He saw the blade swinging in slow motion, shining in the sun. He saw it coming down, not toward the tree, but toward a vein of silver water. He saw the water bleeding out onto the dry stones, crying as it died. He woke up with a start. The sky was changing. The murky grey of the night was dissolving into a bruised purple. The horizon was bleeding a faint, sickly orange. It was dawn. The day of the clearing had arrived. Silas didn't move. He stayed curled at the base of the tree, his arms wrapped around his knees, his chin resting on his chest. He was a statue of resignation. He heard the first sounds of the estate waking up. A rooster crowed, a lonely, jagged sound. A door slammed. Then he heard it. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. The sound of metal clinking against metal, voices low and grumpy. Start at the back wall. Jabin's voice drifted down the alleyway. Clear it all. Anything that moves, kill it. Anything that doesn't, burn it. Silas tightened his grip on his knees. He pressed his back harder against the tree. Wake up, Barnabas, he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Wake up! The footsteps grew louder. The executioners were here. The sanctuary was breached. It happened not with a trumpet blast, but with the crunch of heavy leather boots on fragile gravel. Jabin, the head gardener, stepped into the dead corner, his massive frame blocking out the rising sun. Behind him stood two other labourers, men with arms like knotted ropes, carrying shovels and pickaxes that gleamed dull and heavy in the morning light. They brought the smell of sweat and iron into the clean, dry scent of the corner. They brought the noise of the world into the silence. Jabin stopped. He squinted against the glare, his eyes adjusting to the shadows of the wall. He saw the piles of broken tiles. He saw the weeds, And then he saw the small, curled shape at the base of the dead fig tree. Silas? The name was spoken with a mixture of confusion and irritation. To Jabin, finding the sweeper boy here was like finding a stray cat sleeping in the tool shed. It was out of place. It was messy. Silas uncurled slowly. He stood up, his back pressing firmly against the trunk of Barnabas. His legs were shaking, not from fear, but from the weakness of hunger. But his eyes were wide and dark, fixed on the gardener's face. "What are you doing here, rat?" Jabin grunted, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag. "The courtyards are full of dust. The master's already screaming about the steps." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was too dry to form words, and his heart was hammering so hard it felt like it was lodged in his throat. He spread his arms out slightly, his hands gripping the rough bark of the tree behind him. It was a gesture of protection, a human shield. Jabin frowned. He looked at the boy, then he looked at the tree. He laughed, a short, dry bark of a laugh. "You're guarding the trash," Jabin shook his head. He motioned to the men behind him. "Move, boy, we have work." The master wants this whole corner stripped to the bedrock. He wants to see the foundations. He took a step forward, his heavy boot kicking a shard of pottery aside. Clatter. "I said move." Silas didn't move. He dug his heels into the dust. The tree behind him felt cool and solid, an anchor in the spinning world. "No," Silas whispered. The word was so quiet Jabin barely heard it. He stopped, tilting his head. "What did you say?" Silas swallowed painfully. He looked at the pickaxes. He looked at the shovels. He knew what those tools did. They tore the earth open. They severed roots. They killed. "No," Silas said again, louder this time. The rasp in his voice made it sound like the tearing of cloth. "You can't." Jabin's face darkened. The heat of the last 2 weeks had shortened everyone's temper. He was tired, he was thirsty, and he had a difficult job to do in the blazing sun. He didn't have time for the insolence of a stable orphan. "I can throw you over this wall, boy," Jabin growled. He stepped closer, looming over Silas. "Get out of the way. This stick is coming down first. It's in the way of the wall." "It's not a stick," Silas cried out, his voice cracking. "It's alive." "Alive?" Jabin spat on the ground. The spittle sizzled on a hot rock. "Look at it. It's grey. It's dead. It's firewood." "It has a leaf," Silas pointed up, his hand trembling. "Look!" Jabin glanced up, impatient. He saw the single green leaf hanging from the branch. He paused. For a second, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. A green leaf in the middle of the sharav? It was impossible. But before Jabin could process what he was seeing, a new voice cut through the air. "Why is there shouting?" The voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was a voice that made the labourers drop their eyes and shuffle their feet. Eliphaz the merchant stood at the entrance of the alleyway. He looked terrible. His fine robes were stained with dust. His face was gaunt, the skin drawn tight over his cheekbones. He looked like a man who had been eaten from the inside by anxiety. He was personally inspecting the work, driven by the madness of his dying fortune. Jabin bowed low. "Master, the boy. He's refusing to move. He's hiding behind this dead tree." Eliphaz walked forward. He moved with a jerky, nervous energy. He stopped in front of Silas. He didn't look at the boy. He looked at the tree. He stared at the gnarled trunk. He stared at the grey bark. And then his eyes locked onto the leaf, the green leaf. It was dark, glossy, and turgid with water. It looked like a jewel. In a garden where the pomegranates were brown and curling, this single leaf was an insult. It was rich. It was arrogant. Eliphaz's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, invading Silas's space. He reached out a hand and touched the leaf. He felt the coolness. He felt the moisture. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "Water," Eliphaz whispered. He looked down at Silas. His gaze was terrifying. It wasn't angry, it was cold and calculating. "My pomegranates are dying," Eliphaz said softly. "My vines are turning to dust. The wells are dry. And yet, here is this weed, this useless piece of scrub wood, and it is drinking." He looked at Jabin. "Do you see?" "Master," Jabin asked, with confused, "it is a parasite that—" Eliphaz hissed. His voice rose, trembling with hysteria. "Don't you see? The water isn't leaking out of the walls. It's being stolen. This thing, this leech, it is sucking the moisture from the ground before it can reach the orchard." It was the logic of a desperate man, twisted by fear. To Eliphaz, the tree's survival was not a miracle, it was a theft. It was the reason for his poverty. "But master," Silas gasped, "I watered it. I gave it my cup." Eliphaz looked at the boy with disdain. "Your cup? You think a cup of water keeps a tree green in this hell? No." He pointed a shaking finger at the tree. "It has found a leak in the cisterns. It is drinking my gold." The verdict was delivered. The logic was sealed. "Cut it down," Eliphaz ordered. Silas screamed. It was a raw, animal sound. He turned and threw his arms around the trunk of Barnabas. He hugged the rough wood, pressing his face against the bark. No, he found the river. He dug for it," Silas sobbed into the wood. "Don't kill him! Get him away!" Eliphaz commanded, turning his back. "And then dig up the roots. I want to find where the pipe is broken." Jabin stepped forward. He reached down and grabbed Silas by the back of his tunic. "Let go, kid," Jabin muttered. Not unkindly, but firmly. Silas held on. He locked his fingers together. He wrapped his legs around the base. It became a knot. "No!" Silas shrieked. "He is my friend. He is the giant." Jabin pulled. Silas's grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. The rough bark tore at the skin of his arms. He didn't care. He was fused to the tree. "Pull him off," Eliphaz shouted, losing his patience. "Do I have to do everything myself?" One of the other labourers stepped in. Together, they pried Silas's fingers loose. They dragged him backward, his heels scraping furrows in the gravel. "Barnabas!" Silas screamed, reaching out his hand. Jabin shoved Silas into the arms of the labourer. "Hold him there. Don't let him run." Then Jabin turned back to the tree. He picked up the heavy iron pickaxe. He hefted it in his hands, testing the weight. "It's just wood, boy," Jabin said over his shoulder. "Look away." Silas couldn't look away. He hung in the grip of the labourer, panting, tears streaming down his dusty face, cutting clean tracks through the grime. He watched Jabin raise the pickaxe. The sun glinted off the metal tip. It was blindingly bright. "The roots," Eliphaz ordered from the side. "Go for the roots. I want to see what's underneath." Jabin nodded. He didn't aim for the trunk. He aimed for the ground, right at the base of the tree, right where Silas had poured his offerings for weeks. "One," Jabin grunted. He swung. The pickaxe whistled through the hot air. Time seemed to slow down for Silas. He saw the arc of the metal. He saw the defenceless grey bark. He saw the single green leaf trembling in the wind of the swing. Pop! The sound of the impact was not what anyone expected. The sound that followed Jabin's swing was not the dull, fleshy thud of metal cutting into wood. It was a sound that belonged to the geology of mountains, not the biology of gardens. Clang, crack. It was a sharp, high-pitched retort, like a hammer striking a bronze bell buried deep in the earth. The noise rang out, echoing off the high stone walls of the dead corner, causing the few remaining flies to scatter in panic. Jabin cried out, dropping the handle of the pickaxe. He staggered back, shaking his hands. The vibration of the impact had travelled up the hickory shaft and exploded into his forearms, numbing his fingers instantly. "By the temple," Jabin swore, gripping his wrist. "It's iron. There's iron down there." The pickaxe remained embedded in the ground, its metal head buried halfway into the soil at the base of the tree. It had not severed the trunk. It had missed the main wood by an inch, driving straight down into the earth where the roots disappeared. Silas, still held in the grip of the labourer, stopped struggling. He stared at the handle of the pickaxe, which was vibrating slightly, like a tuning fork. Eliphaz stepped forward, his face twisted with impatience. "Iron," he snapped. "Don't be a fool. It's a pipe. I told you, it's the main conduit to the cisterns. You've hit the casing." He pointed a shaking finger at the hole. "See? The thief is exposed. This tree has wrapped its roots around my plumbing. Pull it out. Break the seal." Jabin flexed his hands, wincing. He didn't want to touch the tool again. He looked at the ground with a strange unease. He had dug many holes in Jericho. He knew the feel of hitting a clay pipe. He knew the feel of hitting a rock. This felt different. It felt like he had struck a door that was trying to push back. "Do it!" Eliphaz screamed, his voice cracking. "Or you are out on the street with a boy!" Jabin gritted his teeth. He stepped back to the tool. He spat on his hands for grip. He grabbed the handle of the pickaxe with both hands. "Heave!" He pulled back, using his massive shoulders as a lever. He meant to rip the earth open, to tear the roots up and expose the pipe beneath. The earth resisted. The pickaxe was wedged tight in something solid. Jabin planted his boot against the trunk of Barnabas for leverage. He groaned with effort. The muscles in his neck corded, grind, screech. The sound of metal scraping against stone set Silas's teeth on edge. It was the sound of the earth crying out in pain. "Come on!" Jabin shouted. He gave a mighty, violent jerk. Crack! The ground didn't just open, it fractured. A large slab of the hard-packed surface soil, cemented together by years of heat, lifted up like a trapdoor. Jabin stumbled backward, losing his balance, the pickaxe flying from his hands. And then the silence returned. Everyone froze. They looked at the hole Jabin had created. It was a jagged wound in the earth, perhaps a foot wide, right next to the main taproot of the tree. Eliphaz leaned in, his eyes hungry for the sight of his broken pipe. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where is the leak?" Silas watched from his captivity. He felt a strange buzzing in his feet, the same buzzing he had felt in his dream. "Listen," Silas whispered. At first, there was nothing. Just the dry heat and the dust settling. Then came the sound. Shh. It was the sound of a snake, or a tyre losing air. It was a sharp, sibilant hiss rising from the bottom of the hole. Eliphaz frowned. "What is that?" He took a step closer, peering into the darkness of the pit. "Is that gas? Is it—" The hiss changed pitch. It deepened. It became a gurgle. Glug, glug, glug. It sounded like the stomach of a great beast waking up. Jabin backed away, his eyes wide. "Master, that's not a pipe. Pipes don't breathe." Suddenly, a puff of air blasted out of the hole, cool, damp air. It hit Eliphaz in the face, blowing his beard back. He gasped, stumbling back in shock. The air smelled of wet limestone, of deep caverns, of things that had not seen the sun for 1,000 years. And then, the miracle broke. It didn't explode like a geyser. It wasn't violent. It was simply unstoppable. From the dark gash in the earth, water began to rise. It bubbled up, clear and effervescent, foaming slightly as it hit the air. It filled the hole Jabin had dug in seconds. It spilled over the lip of the crater. It washed over the dusty boots of Eliphaz the merchant. "Water," Eliphaz whispered, looking down at his wet sandals. He fell to his knees. He plunged his hands into the rising liquid. He brought a handful to his mouth. He expected the stale, warm taste of the cistern water. He expected the muddy taste of the river. He froze. The water was ice cold. It shocked his teeth. It tasted of minerals, clean, sharp, and pure. It was living water. Mayim chayim, fresh from the deep, not stored in any man-made tank. It's sweet," Eliphaz stammered. He looked up at Jabin, his eyes wide with bewilderment. "This isn't from the cisterns. This isn't my water." The flow increased. The water was no longer just bubbling, it was pulsing. Throb, throb, throb. It pushed out of the ground with the rhythm of a heartbeat. It washed over the pile of broken tiles. It swirled around the base of the fig tree. Silas, still held by the labourer, felt the man's grip loosen. The labourer was staring at the ground, his mouth open. Silas pulled his arm free. No one stopped him. He walked forward. He walked into the water. It soaked his sandals. It cooled his burning, dusty feet. He approached the tree. The pickaxe had missed the root. But in prying up the rock, Jabin had done what the root had been trying to do for weeks. He had broken the final seal. He had shattered the capstone of the underground spring. Silas looked at the tree. Barnabas stood in the centre of the rising pool. The water swirled around the gnarled bark, rising higher, soaking into the dry wood. The tree looked like a king standing in a bath of diamonds. "You did it," Silas whispered to the tree. "You led them right to it." Jabin was still on the ground, staring at the pickaxe. "I struck the rock," he muttered, looking at his hands. "I struck the rock and water came out." The water was flowing faster now. It began to find a path. It trickled out of the dead corner, moving down the slope of the alleyway. It carved a small channel through the dust, heading toward the main garden. Eliphaz stood up. He looked at the boy. Then he looked at the water flowing past him. For the first time in his life, the merchant did not look like a man calculating profit. He looked like a man who had forgotten the math. "A spring," Eliphaz said, his voice hushed. "A hidden spring. Right here, in the garbage." He turned to Silas. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a terrifying wonder. "You knew," Eliphaz said. It wasn't a question. Silas shook his head slowly. "I didn't know, Master. I just gave him a drink." He pointed to the tree. He did the digging. The water continued to rise, washing away the dust of the sharav, washing away the fear of the morning. The sound of the flowing stream filled the dead corner, louder than the wind, louder than the voice of any master. It was the sound of a promise kept. The dead corner was dead no more. Water does not ask for permission. It does not wait for a gate to be opened or a decree to be read. It obeys only gravity and the contours of the earth. The spring that had erupted from the fractured limestone of the dead corner was no longer a puddle. It was a force. It spilled over the lip of the crater Jabin had dug, cascading over the jagged edges of the broken tiles with a joyful, reckless energy. It turned the dust of the alleyway into a dark, swirling slurry for a moment, before running clear and strong, carving a path through the neglect. Silas stood ankle-deep in the cold flood. He watched the water move. It was mesmerizing. It snaked around his legs, tugging at the hem of his tunic. It swirled around the trunk of Barnabas, creating a small, shimmering moat before finding the slope of the ground. "It's leaving," Silas whispered. The water had found the ancient gradient of the estate. The dead corner, being the highest point of the property, built on the old bedrock, was naturally positioned to feed everything below it. For years, this elevation had made it the driest, most forsaken spot. Now, it made it the headwaters. The stream flowed past the stunned figure of Jabin, who was still kneeling, staring at his pickaxe as if it were a holy relic. It flowed past Eliphaz, who stepped back, lifting the hem of his expensive robe to avoid the mud, his eyes wide and unblinking. The water moved down the narrow service corridor. It picked up speed. Rush. Hush. Gurgle. It hit the first junction of the paved courtyard. To the servants hiding in the kitchen, huddled in the stifling heat, the sound must have been terrifying. It sounded like a sudden wind, or the hissing of 1,000 snakes. The cook was the first to look out. He peered through the wooden shutters, his face grey with heat exhaustion. "Look!" he cried, his voice cracking. "The floor is moving." The servants poured out into the courtyard. They stopped dead. Across the white, dusty cobblestones, a sheet of water was advancing. It wasn't the muddy, brown sludge of a flash flood. It was crystal clear, sparkling in the morning sun like liquid glass. It moved with a serene purpose, filling the cracks between the stones, cooling the baked rock instantly. Steam rose in thin, ghostly wisps where the cold water touched the hot ground. Eliphaz came running out of the alleyway, splashing through the stream. He looked frantic, but not with fear. He was waving his arms. "The channels," he shouted, pointing toward the dying orchard. "Guide it to the channels. Don't let it run into the street." It was the instinct of the merchant returning, capture the resource. But there was no need for commands. The water knew where to go. The main irrigation trenches of the pomegranate orchard had been dug centuries ago, laid out by architects who understood the tilt of the land. The stream from the dead corner found the main intake, a dry, dusty ditch lined with clay bricks, and poured into it with a satisfied roar. Silas followed the procession. He walked behind Eliphaz, behind Jabin, behind the water. He felt like a small boat bobbing in the wake of a great ship. He watched the water enter the orchard. It was a resurrection scene. The trenches, which had been dry scars in the earth for weeks, suddenly filled with light. The water raced down the lines, branching off into the smaller capillaries that fed the individual trees. Silas stopped by the great pomegranate, the massive, dying tree he had pitied just yesterday. The water reached its base. It circled the trunk, filling the basin that had been dug around the roots. The dry earth bubbled and hissed, drinking greedily. Silas watched the soil change colour. It turned from a pale, deathly beige to a rich, fertile black. He imagined the roots below, those shallow, pampered roots, waking up in shock. They were being bathed in the coldest, purest water they had ever known. "Drink," Silas whispered, echoing the word he'd said to Barnabas so many nights ago. "It's a gift from the trash heap." The air in the garden began to change immediately. The oppressive, dry heat of the Sharav was pierced by the coolness rising from the open trenches. The smell of wet earth, that primal, intoxicating scent of petrichor, rose up and overwhelmed the smell of dust. The servants were weeping. Some of them fell to their knees by the trenches, scooping up the water in their hands, drinking it straight from the ground. They splashed it on their faces, laughing and crying at the same time. The discipline of the house, the hierarchy of master and slave, dissolved in the face of the flood. Eliphaz stood in the centre of his orchard. He was not directing anyone. He was simply watching his fortune being saved. He looked at the water rushing past his boots. Then he looked back toward the high stone walls of the backyard. He looked back toward the dead corner. Silas saw the realization hit the master's face. Eliphaz was doing the math, but it was a new kind of math. He'd spent a fortune on cisterns. He had paid for water to be hauled from the river. He had guarded every drop. And all the while, the true source, the inexhaustible deep, had been sitting right there, under the pile of broken tiles he had ordered his servants to ignore. He had been walking past his salvation every day, calling it garbage. Jabin walked up to Eliphaz. The big man was soaked to the knees, his boots squelching. He held the pickaxe loosely in one hand. "It's not stopping, master," Jabin said, his voice filled with awe. "It's a true spring. It's coming from the mountain roots." Eliphaz nodded slowly. He reached out and touched a pomegranate branch. The leaves were still brown, but the wood felt different. The tension of death was gone. "The boy," Eliphaz said softly. He turned to look for Silas. Silas shrank back behind a pillar. He suddenly felt very small again. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving him trembling and exposed. He wasn't a hero. He was just the sweeper who had broken the rules. Eliphaz walked over to him. The merchant towered over the boy. His robes were heavy with water, dragging in the mud. "You watered the stick," Eliphaz said. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a statement of fact. Silas nodded, looking at his feet. "Yes, master." "Why?" Eliphaz asked. Why that tree? Why not the roses? Why not the melons? Silas looked up. He looked into the master's tired, anxious eyes. He thought about the spider web. He thought about Goliath the lizard. He thought about the rough bark against his cheek. Because he was alone, Silas said simply, and he was thirsty. Eliphaz stared at him for a long moment. The answer seemed to confuse him, and yet it silenced him. There was an economy Eliphaz didn't understand, the economy of grace. There was no profit in watering a dead stick, and yet that foolish act had kept the soil soft enough, kept the roots alive enough, to guide the iron to the water. Eliphaz looked back at the orchard. The sound of running water was filling the air, a beautiful, symphonic noise. "You are not the sweeper anymore," Eliphaz said abruptly. Silas's heart skipped a beat. Was he being cast out? "You are the keeper," Eliphaz pronounced. He gestured toward the back of the estate. "That corner, that spring, that tree, they're your charge. No one touches them but you." He reached into his belt and pulled out a small silver coin. He pressed it into Silas's dirty palm. "Go," Eliphaz said, his voice thick with emotion. "Go make sure the channel is clear. Don't let the flow stop." Silas closed his fist around the coin. It felt cold and hard. But the water rushing past his feet felt better. He turned and ran. He ran back up the wet slope, splashing through the stream, running against the current. He ran back toward the sanctuary. When he reached the dead corner, he stopped. The scene was peaceful now. The violence of the pickaxe was over. The water was simply flowing, a steady, bubbling presence. Barnabas stood in the centre of it all. The water had washed the dust from his bark. He looked dark, slick, and strong. The single green leaf was bobbing gently in the breeze created by the cool air. Silas walked into the pool. He patted the trunk. "Look at you," Silas laughed, the sound bubbling up from his chest like the spring itself. "You're feeding them all. You're feeding the giants." The tree didn't answer in words. But Silas felt the vibration against his legs. The sap was rising. The water was flowing. The connection was open, and somewhere in the rocks nearby, Silas saw a flash of grey. Goliath the lizard poked his head out from a crevice. He looked at the water, blinked his golden eyes, and scurried down to the water's edge to drink. The ecosystem was returning. Silas sat down on his flat rock, which was now an island in the middle of the stream. He dipped his feet in the water and took a deep breath. The Sharav was still blowing above the walls. The heat was still there. But here, in the corner of the rejected things, it was springtime. The wind from the east finally broke on the third day after the bursting of the spring. The heavy, suffocating blanket of the Sharav lifted, blown away by a fresh, salty breeze arriving from the Mediterranean Sea. Jericho exhaled. In the estate of Eliphaz, the atmosphere had shifted from a funeral to a festival. The sound of the estate was no longer the dry rasp of brooms on dust. It was the melodic, constant burble of running water. Silas stood at the entrance of the main garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked different. He was still wearing his simple tunic, and his sandals were still worn, but his posture had changed. He no longer hunched his shoulders to make himself smaller. He stood straight, like a sapling that has found the sun. He watched the resurrection of the giants. The pomegranate orchard was drinking. It was a slow, majestic process. The leaves, which had been curled tight like burnt paper, were beginning to unfurl. The colour was returning to them, not the pale, dusty green of survival, but the deep, glossy viridian of health. The fruit, though still small, had stopped shrivelling. They hung on the branches like ornaments that were slowly being polished. But Silas knew the truth. He looked at the thick trunks of the pomegranates. "You're drinking from his cup," Silas thought. The water flowing through the brick channels, the lifeblood of this entire garden, was not coming from the river. It was coming from the dead corner. Every drop of moisture in the leaves of the wealthy trees was a gift from the rejected stump in the alleyway. "Silas!" The voice was deep and rumbled like a shifting boulder. It was Jabin. Silas turned. The head gardener was standing there, holding a slate tablet. A week ago, Jabin would have barked an order or ignored the boy entirely. "Today," he nodded respectfully. "The master wants to know the flow rate," Jabin said, looking at the channels. "Is it holding steady?" Silas smiled. "It is stronger in the morning, Jabin, but it never stops. It breathes." "It breathes," Jabin repeated, shaking his head. "I've been a gardener for 30 years and I've never seen a spring that breathes. It's like the earth has lungs." Jabin looked at Silas with a strange expression. It was a mixture of bewilderment and admiration. To Jabin, the earth was something to be conquered with ploughs and axes. To Silas, the earth was something to be listened to. Jabin had the muscles, Silas had the ear. "Come," Jabin said. "We're finishing the stonework in the back. You should see it." They walked together toward the dead corner. The servants they passed stepped aside to let them through. The boy who watered stones had become a bit of a legend in the kitchen. The maids whispered that he'd talked to the rocks. The cook swore he'd seen the boy glowing in the dark, which was untrue, but Silas didn't correct them. When they reached the sanctuary, Silas gasped. The chaos of the excavation was gone. The pile of broken tiles had been cleared away, not by ruthless destruction, but with careful hands. The jagged crater where the pickaxe had struck was now lined with smooth river stones, creating a natural basin. The water bubbled up into this basin, clear and joyful, before spilling over a newly cut lip of stone into the channel that led to the garden. And standing guard over the spring was Barnabas. He was no longer the sleeping giant. He was awake. In just 3 days of unlimited water, the tree had exploded with life. It wasn't just the single leaf anymore. A dozen new shoots had burst from the gnarled branches, each one unfurling a bright, jagged fig leaf. The canopy was still small, sparse and lopsided, but it was undeniably a crown. The grey, dead-looking bark had darkened to a rich charcoal hue. It looked strong. It looked like iron that had learned to be wood. "We cleaned around the roots," Jabin explained, pointing to the base. "We took away the sharp rocks that were cutting into him. We gave him soft earth." Silas walked to the edge of the basin. The air here was 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the estate. Moss was already beginning to paint the wet stones with velvet green. "He likes it," Silas whispered. He looked up into the branches. The spider had returned, spinning a new web between 2 fresh shoots. Goliath the lizard was there too, basking on a rock near the water, looking fat and content. "The master ordered a bench," Jabin said, pointing to the shadow of the wall. There, carved from white limestone, was a simple, elegant bench. It was placed perfectly so that anyone sitting on it would be in the shade of the wall, listening to the sound of the spring, looking at the tree. "He says he wants to sit here in the evenings," Jabin said, lowering his voice. "He says the air here helps him think." Silas ran his hand along the smooth stone of the bench. It was strange. This corner had been the place where things went to die. Now, it was the place where the master came to think. The garbage heap had become the throne room. "It is a good bench," Silas said. "And," Jabin added, reaching into his pocket, "he gave orders about the sweeping." Silas looked up. "I am not to sweep any more?" "No," Jabin grinned. "You are still the sweeper, but not the courtyards. You are the keeper of the spring. Your job is to keep this channel clear. Make sure no leaves block the flow. Make sure the basin is clean. That is your only duty." Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The hot, dusty days of sweeping the infinite colonnades were over. His world had shrunk, but it had deepened. He was the guardian of the source. Jabin turned to leave, but he paused. He looked at the tree one last time. "You know, kid," Jabin said, scratching his beard, "I was going to chop it down. I really was." "I know," Silas said. "I thought it was stealing," Jabin admitted. "I didn't know it was the pump." He looked at Silas. How did you know? How did you know it was worth saving? Silas looked at the twisted trunk. He remembered the nights of thirst. He remembered the feeling of the rough bark against his cheek. He remembered the silence. I didn't know it was a pump, Silas said softly. I just knew it was alive, and living things deserve water. Jabin nodded slowly. He clapped a heavy hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture of equality, man to man. Then he walked away, leaving Silas alone in his kingdom. Silas sat on the new white bench. He listened to the water, burble, splash, rush. It was a happy sound. He looked at Barnabas. The tree seemed to be standing taller, puffing out its chest of new leaves. You're famous now, Silas told the tree. You have a stone basin. You have a gardener. You have the master visiting you. A light breeze rustled the new leaves. Shh, Silas smiled. He knew that the fame didn't matter to the tree. The tree didn't care about the bench or the master. The tree only cared about the water, the sun, and the boy who had sat with it in the dark. Silas lay down on the bench, staring up at the patch of blue sky framed by the high walls. We have new roots now. Barnabas, he whispered. We aren't going anywhere. The water flowed on, carrying the secret of the dead corner out to the world, turning the desert into a garden, one drop at a time. And the boy, the keeper of the miracle, closed his eyes and finally, for the first time in weeks, slept a sleep without thirst. For years, the mind of Eliphaz the merchant had been a room filled with scales. Everything was weighed. A sack of flour against a silver shekel, a day of labour against a loaf of bread, a jar of oil against a promise of debt. He understood the world through the lens of transaction, input and output, cost and profit. But the spring in the dead corner had broken his scales. It was evening, a week after the miracle. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft washes of indigo and bruised peach. In his private study, surrounded by scrolls of papyrus and tablets of clay, Eliphaz sat staring at his ledgers. The numbers were all there. The harvest was saved. The pomegranates were drinking. The wealth of his estate was secure. By all accounts, he should be celebrating. He should be ordering a feast. But the numbers felt cold. They felt small. He dipped his quill into the inkwell, hovered it over the column marked water expenses, and then let it drop. Plink. He couldn't balance the books. How do you write down the value of boy's thirst? How do you calculate the worth of a root that drills through rock? There was no column for grace. There was no column for stubborn hope. Eliphaz stood up. Leaving the ink to dry on the page, needed to go to the source. He walked out of the main house, his heavy robes rustling softly against the stone floor. He bypassed the main garden, where the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and recovering pomegranates. He headed for the narrow alleyway. When he reached the dead corner, he stopped in the shadows, unseen. The scene before him was one of utter tranquility. The lantern Jabin had hung on the wall cast a warm, golden circle of light over the stone basin. The water murmured its constant, cheerful prayer as it spilled over the lip. And there was Silas. The boy was not sweeping. He was not rushing. He was sitting cross-legged on the ground near the water's edge, holding a small, wet rag. He was gently wiping the dust from the lower leaves of Barnabas. It was a tender motion, like a mother washing the face of a child. Eliphaz felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had owned slaves and servants all his life. He knew how to command them, how to feed them, how to punish them. But he had never seen a servant love something that belonged to the master. He realized, with a jolt of humility, that the tree did not belong to the master. The deed to the land was in Eliphaz's safe, but the life of the tree belonged to the boy. Eliphaz stepped into the light. "The leaves are clean, Silas," he said softly. Silas jumped, scrambling to his feet. He bowed instinctively. "Master, I was just..." "Peace." Eliphaz raised a hand. He walked over to the new white limestone bench and sat down heavily. He let out a long sigh. the sound of a man putting down a heavy load. "Sit," Eliphaz commanded, gesturing to the other end of the bench. Silas hesitated. To sit with the master was unheard of. It broke every rule of the household. "Sit," Eliphaz repeated, his voice gentle. "The stone is cool." Silas sat on the very edge of the bench, his feet barely touching the ground, his hands folded in his lap. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the water. Burble, splash, hush. "Jabin tells me you named it," Eliphaz said, looking at the tree. "Barnabas." "Yes, master." "Why?" Eliphaz asked. He was genuinely curious. "Why give a name to a piece of firewood?" Silas looked at his hands. "He wasn't firewood to me. He was the only thing in the garden that was struggling like me. And the name. A traveller told me it means son of encouragement. Encouragement!" Eliphaz rolled the word around in his mouth. It tasted strange. He was a man who gave orders, not encouragement. "I thought," Silas continued, his voice quiet, "that if I encouraged him, maybe he wouldn't die. And if he didn't die, maybe I wouldn't either." Eliphaz looked at the boy. He saw the thin arms, the scars on the knees, the large dark eyes that had seen too much hunger. He realised that while he had been worrying about his profit margins, this child had been fighting a war for survival right in his backyard. Eliphaz looked at the tree. In the lantern light, the new leaves shone like polished jade. The trunk was thick and dark. It stood tall, proud and deeply anchored. "I was blind," Eliphaz whispered. "Master?" "I only looked up," Eliphaz said that. Tracing the grain of the stone bench with his finger, I looked at the fruit. I looked at the canopy. I looked at the things that the sun touches. He leaned forward, looking intently at the spot where the water bubbled out of the rock. "I never looked down," he confessed. "I never asked what was happening in the dark. I didn't know that the real work, the digging, the pushing, the bleeding, happens where no one can see." He turned to Silas. The distance between the rich merchant and the orphan boy seemed to vanish. "You possess a wisdom I do not have, Silas," Eliphaz said solemnly. "I know how to count fruit, but you know how to find water." Silas didn't know what to say. He had never been praised for wisdom. He just liked the tree. Eliphaz reached out and touched the rough bark of Barnabas. "I have pomegranates that are worth 100 silver pieces. But they have shallow roots. They panic when the wind blows." He patted the trunk. This one has been to the deep places. This one knows the bedrock." Eliphaz looked at Silas. "I think I need to learn from this tree. I've been living on the surface too long." The master sat back, closing his eyes. He listened to the sound of the spring. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing. He wasn't calculating the yield of the next harvest. He wasn't worrying about the price of oil in Damascus. He was simply sitting. "It is peaceful here," Eliphaz murmured. "Yes," Silas agreed. "The ants think so too." Eliphaz cracked a small smile. "The ants? And the lizard," Silas pointed. "Goliath. He lives on the rock." Eliphaz chuckled, a rusty, unused sound. "Goliath. A giant name for a small thing." "He thinks he's big," Silas said. "Perhaps he is," Eliphaz mused. "Perhaps we are the small ones." The master and the boy sat together on the bench as the stars wheeled overhead. The water flowed on, indifferent to rank or station. In the quiet of the dead corner, a different kind of healing was taking place. The water had healed the soil, but the silence was healing the master. Eliphaz realized that his wealth was not in his strongbox. His wealth was this water. His wealth was this tree. His wealth was this boy who understood that even stones could be made to drink. "Stay here, Silas," Eliphaz said softly, not opening his eyes. "Teach me the names of the ants." And so, the merchant began his education in the school of the dust. Time in a garden is not measured by the hourglass or the sundial. It is measured in rings, It is measured in the thickening of bark, the lengthening of shadows, and the slow, deliberate accumulation of fallen leaves that turn into soil. Seasons wheeled over Jericho. The brutal heat of the summer gave way to the brief, balm-like winter, where the rains from the west kissed the stones. Then came the explosion of spring, followed by the long, golden bake of another summer. And through it all, the water flowed. The dead corner had ceased to exist. The name itself had been forgotten by the household, washed away by the constant, cheerful burble of the spring. The servants now called it the Green Room. To walk into the alleyway now was to step into a different country. The harsh, white glare of the Jericho sun was filtered through a living, stained glass window of emerald and jade. The canopy of Barnabas had expanded with a ferocity that startled even Jabin. The roots, having tapped into the inexhaustible deep, pumped life upward with the pressure of a fire hose. The tree was no longer a struggle. It was a cathedral. Its branches, once twisted and agonized, had stretched out, their gnarled elbows softening under layers of new growth. They reached across the alleyway, touching the stone walls on either side and creating a tunnel of cool, dappled shade. The leaves were the size of dinner plates, thick, fuzzy, and deeply lobed, overlapping like the scales of a benevolent dragon. Silas sat on the limestone bench. He was taller now. The hem of his tunic hit him higher on the shin, and his shoulders had broadened from the work of maintaining the channels. But his eyes were the same, dark, watchful, and filled with a quiet reverence. He was watching the traffic. The Green Room had become the busiest intersection in the estate, though not for humans. First came the bees. They arrived in a low, humming cloud, drawn by the invisible scent of the tree's vigour. They danced through the shafts of sunlight that pierced the canopy, gold dust on their legs, drinking from the mossy edges of the stone basin. Then came the birds. Silas watched a pair of yellow-vented bulbuls fluttering in the upper branches. They were arguing over a prime nesting spot in the crook of a sturdy limb. "There is room for both," Silas whispered, smiling. He remembered the days when the air here was silent and dead, when only a single fly would buzz lazily in the heat. Now, the air was a symphony. The chirp of sparrows, the coo of the doves, the hum of the insects, and the underlying bass note of the water. It was a song of abundance. Barnabas was not just living, he was hosting. He had become a landlord. Silas stood up and walked to the water's edge. He dipped his hand into the basin. The water was as cold and sweet as the day it broke through. He cleared a few fallen leaves from the grate, ensuring the flow to the main orchard remained steady. The main orchard was thriving. Of course. Eliphaz's pomegranates were famous again, their fruit large and bursting with ruby seeds. But Silas knew they were merely the beneficiaries. They were the guests at the table. Barnabas was the cook. Silas reached up and touched a low-hanging branch. The leaves parted, and he saw it. The first fruit. It wasn't a pomegranate. It was a fig. It hung heavy and teardrop-shaped, its skin a deep, dusty purple that looked almost black in the shade. It was swollen, the skin stretching tight over the sweet pulp inside. A tiny bead of nectar, thick and golden like honey, had formed at the very bottom of the fruit, a sign that it was perfectly, impossibly ripe. Silas held his breath. He looked around. The garden was quiet. Jabin was in the front courtyard. Eliphaz was in the city. This was a private moment between the keeper and the tree. "You made something," Silas whispered. For years, the tree had focused on survival. It had focused on leaves, on roots, on bark. It had been selfish, out of necessity. But now, it had so much life, so much excess energy bubbling up from the deep, that it could afford to be generous. A fruit is a tree's way of saying, "I have enough." "Here, take some..." Silas reached out. He cupped the fig in his hand. It was warm from the filtered sun, soft and heavy. He gave it a gentle twist. Snap. The stem parted easily. A droplet of white, sticky sap, the milk of the fig, welled up on the branch, sealing the wound instantly. Silas held the fruit in his palm. It was heavy for its size. It felt like a bag of gold coins. He sat back down on the bench. He didn't eat it immediately. He admired it. He looked at the purple skin, dusted with a fine, natural bloom. He smelled it. It smelled of earth and sugar and sunshine. He remembered the dry days. He remembered the cracking thirst. He remembered the empty cup. He broke the fig open. The inside was a galaxy of pink and red flesh, studded with 1,000 tiny seeds. The aroma released was intoxicating, sweet, jammy, and rich. Silas took a bite. The flavour exploded in his mouth. It wasn't just sweet, it was complex. It tasted of the minerals from the deep limestone. It tasted of the cool, dark water. It tasted of the struggle and the victory. It was the best thing Silas had ever eaten. He ate slowly, savouring the texture of the seeds and the smoothness of the flesh. As he finished, he heard the familiar shuffle of sandals on stone. Eliphaz entered the sanctuary. The master had aged. His beard was whiter now, and he walked with a slight stoop. But the lines of anxiety that used to etch his forehead were gone. He carried a scroll in one hand, his daily reading, but he let it hang loosely by his side. He saw Silas wiping his mouth. He saw the purple stain on the boy's fingers. Eliphaz stopped. He looked at the tree. He scanned the branches until he saw another purple teardrop hanging amidst the green. "Figs," Eliphaz said softly. "The first harvest." "Master," Silas said, standing up. Eliphaz waved him down. "Sit, keeper, sit." The master sat next to him. He looked at the flowing water, then up at the dark, heavy fruit. "I remember," Eliphaz said, his voice reflective, "when I called this a stick of firewood. I remember when I ordered Jabin to burn it." "He remembers too," Silas said, patting the trunk. "But he forgives." Eliphaz chuckled. "Trees are better than men, Silas. Men keep score. Trees just grow." Eliphaz reached out and plucked a fig for himself. He didn't inspect it for flaws or weigh it for value. He simply broke it open and ate it. Juice ran down the master's chin. He didn't wipe it away immediately. He closed his eyes, tasting the gift. "It is sweet," Eliphaz murmured. "Sweeter than the pomegranates." "It's the water," Silas said. "Deep water makes sweet fruit." Eliphaz nodded. He looked at Silas. "You have grown, boy. You're almost a man." "The seasons go fast here," Silas replied. "They do." Eliphaz agreed. He looked around the lush, green tunnel of the alleyway. This place. It has become the heart of the house. "The pomegranates make me rich, Silas. But this tree makes me glad." He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "One day," Eliphaz said, staring at the running water, "I will be gone. The estate will pass to my sons. They are merchants. They look at the ledger, not the land." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade. "But," Eliphaz squeezed his shoulder, "I have written a new deed. This corner, this strip of land from the wall to the channel, is not part of the estate anymore." Silas looked at him, confused. "Master." "It is a separate parcel," Eliphaz said firmly, "and it has a designated keeper. As long as this water flows, and as long as this tree stands, you are the guardian here. No one can move you. No one can fire you. You belong to the spring, and the spring belongs to you." Silas stared at the master. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at the tree. Barnabas was not just a friend anymore. He was a home. He was a future. "Thank you," Silas whispered. "Don't thank me." Eliphaz stood up, wiping his hands on his robe. "Thank the water. I'm just balancing the books. A life for a life. You saved the garden. The garden saves you." The master walked away, heading back to his world of commerce and numbers. Silas remained on the bench. He watched a bee land on the sticky remnants of the fig peel he had dropped. He was safe. The sun began to set, turning the light in the green room from emerald to gold. The birds began their evening song, a raucous chorus of gratitude. Silas leaned back, closing his eyes. He listened to the water. It sounded different tonight. It sounded permanent. The boy who had been a stray leaf blown in by the wind had finally put down roots. He was part of the orchard now. The sun did not simply set in the dead corner, it retreated, surrendering the territory to the cool blue dominion of the twilight. For Silas, this was the golden hour. The day's work was done. The channel grate was clear of leaves. The stone basin was scrubbed clean of algae. The flow to the orchard was steady and strong. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to save, nothing left to worry about. There was only the sitting. Silas stretched out on the limestone bench that Eliphaz had commissioned. The stone, having absorbed the warmth of the sun all afternoon, was now radiating a gentle, dry heat against his back, a pleasant contrast to the cool air rising from the water. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to calibrate his hearing. In the old days, silence had been a terrifying thing. It had been the silence of absence, of no water, no life, no hope. But this new silence was different. It was heavy. It was full. It was textured. It was the silence of a library, or a cathedral, where the quiet is not empty space, but a container for something sacred. And filling this container was the voice of the stream. Silas had learned that the water did not make just one sound. It made 100. There was the deep, throaty gurgle where the spring erupted from the fractured rock, a sound like a drumbeat, steady and bass-heavy. Thrum, bum, thrum, bum. Then there was the sharper, brighter sound where the water spilled over the lip of the basin into the channel. This was a chiming sound, like silver bells being shaken in a bag of velvet. Tink, tink, splash. And finally, there was the long, sustained hush as the stream ran down the smooth, mossy trough toward the garden, a sound like the wind in the pines, even when the air was still. "You're singing tonight," Silas murmured, keeping his eyes closed. He imagined the water's journey. He imagined it rising from the cold, sunless caverns deep in the earth, rushing up through the limestone throat, and bursting out into the evening air. It was a happy traveller. It carried the coolness of the deep places and gave it to the hot surface world. Silas shifted his weight, settling deeper into the stone bench. He felt a profound sense of heaviness in his limbs, the good, earned heaviness of a body that is safe. Above him, the canopy of Barnabas was shifting into its night mode. During the day, the leaves of the fig tree were like solar panels, flat and open, drinking the light. But as the evening deepened, they seemed to relax, drooping slightly on their stems, creating a thicker, more impenetrable roof. Silas looked up through the layers of foliage. He could see patches of the darkening sky, now the colour of bruised plums. The first star, the evening star, was caught in the web of branches, flickering like a lantern hung for a feast. The birds had finished their arguments. The yellow-vented bulbuls had settled into their nests high in the crook of the wood. The doves had tucked their heads under their wings, transforming into soft grey spheres of fluff. Even the traffic of the ants had slowed. The lines of workers were retreating into the earth, their day's harvest done. Silas felt a kinship with them all. They were all tenants of the same landlord. They all slept under the same green roof. He slipped his sandals off his feet. He swung his legs over the edge of the bench so that his bare soles hovered just inches above the flowing water in the channel. He lowered his feet. The shock of the cold was instant, sending a shiver up his spine that ended in a sigh. The water swirled around his ankles, massaging the tired muscles, washing away the last dust of the estate. It was liquid ice, numbing and clarifying. He wiggled his toes against the smooth stones on the bottom of the channel. The stones had been polished by the flow, turned into gems of river glass. "Wash it away," Silas whispered. He imagined the water taking more than just the dust. He imagined it taking the memories of the hunger. He imagined it taking the fear of Jabin's axe. He imagined it taking the loneliness of his childhood. The stream took it all. It carried everything away, down the slope, into the orchard, into the earth, recycling it into sweetness for the pomegranates. Silas pulled his feet out and tucked them onto the bench, drying them in the warm air. He lay back down, pillowing his head on his arm. The smell of the corner was intoxicating. It was a blend of damp stone, crushing mint which had started growing wild near the overflow, and the sweet, milky scent of the ripening figs. It was the smell of a sanctuary. He watched a moth flutter near the water, its wings dusty white, dancing a silent ballet over the reflections of the stars. The rhythm of the water began to synchronize with his breathing. Inhale. The water rises in the basin. Exhale. The water spills over the edge. Silas felt the boundaries of his body dissolving. He was no longer a boy lying on a bench. He was a stone in the riverbed. He was a leaf on the branch. He was part of the flow. His thoughts, usually jumping from one worry to another, began to slow down. They became like leaves falling onto the surface of the stream. He watched them drift by. There is the thought about the sweeping, drifting away. There is the thought about the master, drifting away. There is the thought about tomorrow, drifting away. The stream carried them all into the dark, leaving his mind clear and empty, a quiet pool reflecting the moon. Beside him, on the warm rocks, Goliath the lizard shifted. The reptile had found a spot that retained the heat of the day and was flattened against it, eyes closed in reptilian bliss. "Good night, giant," Silas whispered. Goliath didn't move. He was safe. The hawk would not hunt here tonight. The snake would not come. The tree was guarding them. Barnabas stood over them all, silent and strong. The tree didn't sleep in the way animals did, but it had its own rest. It stopped pumping so hard. It let the sap settle. It stood as a sentinel, its thick trunk a pillar of stability in a shifting world. Silas turned on his side, facing the tree. He reached out a hand and let his fingers brush against the rough bark. It was his anchor. As long as he could feel that texture, the ridges, the knots, the solid reality of the wood, he knew he was home. The sound of the water seemed to grow louder as his vision dimmed. It became a white Ciceron, a blanket of sound that wrapped around him, insulating him from the world outside the walls. In the city of Jericho, merchants were counting coins, soldiers were changing guards, beggars were looking for shelter. But in the green room, there was no commerce, no war, no want. There was only the giving of the water and the receiving of the earth. Silas's breathing deepened. His hand fell away from the tree, resting on the stone bench. His fingers uncurled. The tension in his jaw released. He didn't dream of deep roots tonight. He didn't dream of struggling through the dark earth. That work was done. Tonight, he dreamed he was a boat, a small wooden boat with no oars floating down a gentle, endless river. The canopy of leaves above him was the sky, and the stars were figs hanging low enough to touch. He wasn't steering. He wasn't rowing. He was just drifting, held by the current, moving toward a dawn that was bright and kind. The water sang its lullaby to the stones. Hush, hush, hush. And the boy who watered stones slept the sleep of the justified, guarded by the giant he had woken from the dust. While the boy slept on the white limestone bench, wrapped in the warm, dry air of the Jericho night, the water continued its journey. It flowed past his resting feet, bubbling over the smooth river stones, singing its ancient song. But to truly understand the song, one must understand the instrument. The miracle of the dead corner was not magic. It was not a suspension of the laws of nature, as the servants whispered in the kitchen. It was something far more profound. It was the exquisite, terrifying precision of geology meeting biology. Underneath the sleeping body of Silas, beneath the layer of gravel he had swept for years, beneath the clay floor of the estate, lay the history of the world. Jericho is built on a scar. It sits deep in the Jordan Rift Valley, a place where the earth's crust pulled apart millions of years ago, creating a wound that filled with sediment and stone. Deep, deep down, far below the reach of any shovel, lay the hard place. It was a shelf of Cenomanian limestone, a layer of rock as white as bone and as hard as iron. For 10,000 years, this shelf had acted as a lid. Trapped beneath this lid was the treasure. It was an aquifer of fossil water, rain that had fallen on the Judean mountains before Abraham walked the land, before the walls of Jericho fell, before the first brick of Eliphaz's estate was laid. This water had trickled down through the mountains, filtered through miles of sand and settled in a pressurized cavern of rock, waiting. It was pure, it was cold, and it was desperate to rise. But the lid was tight. The limestone cap was flawless, sealed by the weight of the ages, until the tree. Barnabas was a Ficus sycamorus, a sycamore fig. These trees are the engineers of the plant kingdom. They possess a secret weapon that the pampered pomegranates of the main garden did not have. Pomegranates are surface dwellers. They spread their roots wide and shallow, begging the sky for rain. But the fig is a miner. When Silas had poured his first bowl of dirty wash water onto the dry earth weeks ago, he had not just wetted the dirt, he had triggered a biological machine. The water had soaked down to the root tips. Inside the microscopic cells of the roots, a process called turgor pressure began. The cells filled with water and expanded, becoming rigid. They became hard enough to push. Without Silas's water, the roots would have been flaccid, soft, unable to drill. But with the boy's gift, the roots turned into diamond-tipped drills. They pushed down, they hit the limestone lid, and then the tree did something else. It didn't just push, it dissolved. The roots of the fig tree secreted a mild acid, a chemical prayer exuded into the dark. This acid ate into the calcium of the rock, softening it, microscopic grain by microscopic grain. It was a slow work in imagery. It was a work of centimetres per year. But the tree was dying of thirst. The shower of heat wind had accelerated the need. The tree had poured every ounce of its energy, every drop of water Silas had sacrificed from his own cup, into that main taproot. It was a suicide mission. The tree had abandoned its leaves, abandoned its growth, to focus all its power on that one point of contact with the rock, and it had won. Just before Jabin's pickaxe had swung, the root had punched a hairline fracture through the capstone. It had found the fault line. When Jabin struck the earth, he hadn't created the spring, he had merely opened the door that the tree had unlocked. Silas, sleeping peacefully on the bench, did not know about the limestone shelf. He did not know about turgor pressure or root acid. He did not know that he had been the fuel for a biological drill. He only knew that he had loved a stick, and the stick had given him a river. But the water knew. As it rushed up from the deep, carrying the chill of the underground cavern, it carried a memory of the dark. It was living water because it moved. It wasn't stagnant like the cisterns of Eliphaz. Cistern water is dead. It sits and waits and grows warm. Spring water is alive. It is a verb. It is always becoming something new. The water flowed out of the basin now, clear and strong. It moved past the sleeping boy. It moved past the sleeping lizard. It flowed into the channels of the garden. It carried with it minerals from the deep earth. Calcium, magnesium, potassium. These were the nutrients the pomegranates had been starving for. The surface soil of the garden was exhausted, depleted by years of harvest. But this new water was a liquid fertilizer, rich with the stuff of mountains. That was why the figs were sweet. That was why the pomegranates were swelling. They were eating the mountains. The design was perfect. The disaster of the drought had forced the tree to dig. The poverty of the boy had forced him to pay attention to the small things. The cruelty of the master had forced the excavation. Every broken piece had fit together to break the rock. A light breeze stirred the canopy of Barnabas. The leaves rustled, a sound like dry silk rubbing together. The tree stood guard over the spring it had liberated. It was a mediator. It stood between the rock and the sky, between the deep water and the dry air. It pulled the water up and breathed it out through its leaves, creating a microclimate of cool humidity that blessed everything around it. This is the geology of grace. The treasure is always there, buried deep, waiting under the hard places. But it cannot release itself. It needs a root to break the rock. And the root needs a boy to pour the water. It is a partnership. Silas shifted in his sleep, a small smile touching his lips. He was dreaming of floating, and in a way, he was. He was floating on a raft of limestone, drifting over a sea of ancient water, held safe by the physics of a world that was far more generous than he had ever imagined. The water bubbled on. Glug, glug, hush. It was the sound of the earth rejoicing that the seal was broken. It was the sound of a secret that could no longer be kept. And in the silence of the dead corner, the connection between the deep and the high was complete. The circuit was closed. The garden was whole. The cup of the dead corner did not just fill, it ran over. This is the nature of a true spring. A cistern has a limit. It holds what it is given until it is empty. But a spring is a doorway to the infinite. The water from the deep limestone aquifer kept coming, gallon after gallon, hour after hour, day after day. It filled the stone basin beneath Barnabas. It filled the long, brick-lined channels of the pomegranate orchard. It soaked the roots of the roses, the figs, and the vines. The earth of the estate, once cracked and thirsty, became saturated. It could drink no more. And so, the water sought a new path. Silas stood at the far end of the orchard, where the manicured garden met the high outer wall of the estate. This was the boundary of Eliphaz's world. Inside was the green paradise. Outside was the dusty, noisy, chaotic street of Jericho. For years, this wall had been a barrier against the world. It kept the beggars out. It kept the dust out. It kept the thieves out. But walls cannot stop water. At the base of the wall, there was a small, iron-grated sluice, a drainage hole designed to let out the heavy rains of winter so the garden wouldn't flood. It had been dry for years, clogged with cobwebs and dead leaves. Now, the clear, cold stream from the dead corner had reached it. Silas watched the water swirl around the iron bars. It pushed against the debris. It rose. And then, with a soft gurgle, it slipped through. The water had escaped. Silas felt a momentary pang of anxiety. This was the master's water. It was the gold of the estate. Was he supposed to stop it? Was he supposed to build a dam? He looked back toward the house. Eliphaz was standing on the terrace, watching the flow. The merchant saw the water reaching the wall. He saw it slipping through the grate, leaving his property. In the old days, Eliphaz would have shouted. He would have ordered Jabin to block the drain, to hoard every precious drop in jars, to sell the excess to the neighbours. But Eliphaz stood still. He raised a hand in a quiet gesture of release. Let it go. Silas turned back to the wall. He climbed up the ladder used for pruning the high vines and peered over the top of the stone barrier. He wanted to see where the river went. The street outside was the Via Maris, the way of the sea. It was a trade route, beaten hard by the hooves of camels, the wheels of chariots, and the sandals of 1,000 travellers. It was a place of heat and noise. The air smelled of donkey dung and dry straw. The ground was a pulverised white powder that coated everything in a ghostly film. And into this dry, monochrome world, the water trickled out. It emerged from the small hole at the base of the wall. It spilled onto the dusty cobblestones. It didn't dry up instantly, as a cup of water would have. It had the weight of the spring behind it. It began to form a pool. The pool grew. It filled the depression in the road. Then it overflowed the pool and began to run down the gutter, a thin, sparkling ribbon of silver cutting through the white dust. Silas watched from his high perch, hidden by the ivy. A stray dog was the first to find it. It was a Canaan dog, thin and mangy, with ribs showing through its tawny coat. It trotted down the shadow of the wall, its tongue lolling out, panting in the heat. It stopped. It smelled the wetness. The dog approached the stream cautiously. It sniffed the water. Then it began to lap. Slurp, slurp, slurp. Silas smiled. It was Goliath the lizard all over again, but bigger. Then came a donkey. It was heavily laden with sacks of grain, its head hanging low, its owner walking behind it with a switch. The donkey smelled the water before it saw it. It veered sharply toward the wall, ignoring the shouts of the driver. The beast plunged its muzzle into the stream. It drank deep, shuddering draughts, its long ears twitching with pleasure. "Hey!" the driver shouted, running up. He raised his switch to hit the animal. Then he saw the water. The driver stopped. He looked at the clear stream flowing out of the wall of the rich merchant's house. He looked at his own dusty feet. He dropped the switch. He knelt down beside his donkey. He cupped his hands. Silas watched the man drink. He saw the dust wash off the man's face. He saw the tension leave the man's shoulders. "Blessed be the name," the driver whispered, wiping his mouth. He didn't know where the water came from. He didn't know about the boy or the tree or the pickaxe. To him, it was just a mercy. A sudden, unexplained kindness in a hard world. The stream continued to flow. It moved down the street, past the baker's shop, past the potter's stall. People stopped. They pointed. "Look," a woman with a basket of laundry said. "The gutter is running." "It's the estate of Eliphaz," a man replied. "His cisterns must have burst." "No," said another. "It's too clear. Cistern water is brown. This is mountain water." Children came running. They splashed in the puddles, laughing as the cold water hit their bare legs. They made tiny boats out of wood chips and floated them down the current. The street, usually a place of business and transit, became a place of pause. Silas watched it all. He realised something profound. The water didn't change just the garden. It changed the street. It changed the mood of the city. The dust was settled. The air was cooled. The tempers were soothed. And the source of it all was Barnabas. The tree in the dead corner was doing more than surviving. It was blessing people it would never see. Its roots were pumping enough life to wash the feet of strangers half a mile away. Silas looked back at the dead corner. He couldn't see the tree from here, but he knew it was there, standing in the shade, working silently. This was the river of life. It wasn't a mighty torrent like the Jordan. It was a humble stream, born in a trash heap, flowing out through a grate. But it was enough. It was enough to save a leaf. It was enough to save a garden. It was enough to save a master's soul. And now, it was enough to cool the tongue of a donkey on the Jericho road. Silas climbed down from the ladder. He walked back to the dead corner. The sound of the water was louder here. It was the engine room. He sat on the bench next to the basin. He thought about the cup he had poured out weeks ago, his own ration of water. He had thought he was losing it. He had thought he was throwing it away into the dirt. But nothing is ever lost. The cup he gave had become a river. It had multiplied. It had come back to him, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Eliphaz appeared in the archway. He had walked all the way from the house. He looked at Silas, and then at the water rushing toward the grate. "I saw them," Eliphaz said quietly. "I looked over the wall." "The donkey driver?" Silas asked. "And the children?" Eliphaz nodded. "They are playing in my runoff." The merchant paused. "A month ago, I would have charged them for it." "And now?" Eliphaz watched a leaf float by on the current. "Now," he smiled, a genuine, soft expression. "I think we should widen the grate," Silas laughed. It was a sound of pure joy. "Let it flow. "Silas," Eliphaz commanded. But it was a gentle command. "Let it all flow out. We have plenty. We have the deep." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water. The stream turned from silver to gold, then to indigo, but it did not stop. It flowed on into the night, a silent benevolence pouring out from the house of Eliphaz, turning the dusty streets of Jericho into a place where a weary traveller might find a drink, and wonder at the mystery of a river that sprang from nowhere. The garden had healed, but the hierarchy of the house remained a stubborn thing. Stone walls are easy to breach with water. The walls between master and servant are harder to dissolve. Silas knew his place. He was the keeper of the spring. Yes, he was the guardian of Barnabas, but he was still Silas the orphan, Silas the sweeper, Silas who slept on a mat in the common quarters. When Eliphaz came to the dead corner in the evenings, Silas would stand. If the master sat on the limestone bench, Silas would sit on the ground or on the edge of the stone basin, keeping a respectful distance. It was the geometry of their world, one head higher than the other. But the water was eroding that geometry, just as it had eroded the limestone cap. It began with a noise in the late afternoon. Silas was pruning a low branch of the fig tree. Barnabas was growing so fast now that he needed gentle guidance to keep the path clear. When he heard the sound of dragging, he turned to see Jabin entering the alleyway. The big gardener was pulling a heavy wooden sledge. On the sledge lay a beautiful, polished slab of olive wood, dark and swirled with the grain of centuries. Behind him, a carpenter carried a bag of bronze tools. "Jabin?" Silas asked, stepping down from the rock. "What is this?" Jabin wiped his brow. He looked at the white limestone bench where the master usually sat. "The master says the stone is too cold for old bones," Jabin grunted. "He wants wood. He wants a backrest." Silas nodded. It made sense. Eliphaz was an old man. He deserved comfort in his sanctuary. "Where should we put it?" Silas asked, looking around the small space. "There isn't much room." He drew a map, Jabin said, pulling a scrap of papyrus from his belt. He squinted at it. "He wants it. There." He pointed to the spot directly opposite the limestone bench. Silas frowned. "Facing the wall?" "No," Jabin said. "Facing the other bench." They set to work. The carpenter drilled into the stone wall to anchor the supports. Jabin lifted the heavy olive slab. The smell of sawdust, sharp and resinous, mixed with the damp scent of the spring. It was the smell of creation. By the time the sun began to dip, the work was done. It was a beautiful seat. It was wide and deep, polished to a satin sheen with beeswax. It was positioned perfectly in the shade, directly across from the simple white stone bench that had been there since the spring broke through. "It is a throne," Silas whispered, running his hand over the smooth wood. "It fits a master." Jabin gathered his tools. He looked at the arrangement. The stone bench on one side of the stream, the wooden bench on the other. A small conversation circle, with the water flowing between them. "The master is coming," Jabin warned. "Look sharp." Eliphaz arrived a few minutes later. He carried a small basket covered with a linen cloth. He walked with a lighter step these days. The burden of the drought had lifted, taking 10 years off his shoulders. He stopped at the entrance of the green room. He looked at the new wooden seat. He nodded, satisfied. Silas bowed. "Your seat is ready, master. It is very fine wood." Eliphaz walked into the sanctuary. He approached the new, polished olive wood bench. He touched it, testing the smoothness. Then he turned around and sat down. But he didn't sit on the wood. He sat on the old, hard limestone bench. Silas blinked. "Master, the new seat. It is over there." Eliphaz smiled. He placed the basket on the ground. "I know where it is, Silas. I ordered it." He gestured to the beautiful wooden seat opposite him. "Sit," Eliphaz commanded. Silas froze. "Me?" "Sit," Eliphaz said again. "The stone is cold for you too, boy. You're thin. You have no padding." "But master," Silas stammered, "that is olive wood." That is expensive. That is for guests. You are the host here, Eliphaz said simply. I am the guest. I told you before, this corner belongs to the spring, and you are the keeper. It is only right that the keeper has a proper seat. Silas stared at the wooden bench. It looked impossibly inviting. To sit there would mean sitting face to face with Eliphaz. It would mean their knees would be only a few feet apart. It would mean looking the master in the eye, not looking up from the dust. Go on, Eliphaz urged gently. Barnabas wants you to be comfortable. Silas walked slowly to the wooden bench. He sat down tentatively, perching on the edge as if ready to bolt. The wood was warm and smooth. It held him. It supported his back. He looked across the small stream. Eliphaz was sitting on the hard stone, smiling. Better? Eliphaz asked. It is? Ah, soft, Silas whispered. Good. Eliphaz leaned forward and uncovered the basket. Inside were 2 cups of wine and a loaf of bread, broken into pieces. In the city, Eliphaz began, pouring the wine. Men fight for the highest seat. They want the chair with the tallest back. They want to sit on the dais so they can look down on others. He handed a cup across the stream to Silas. Silas took it with both hands, careful not to spill a drop of the crimson liquid into the clear water. But here, Eliphaz continued, taking his own cup, the water flows down. The tree grows up from the dirt. The rules are different. He took a sip of wine. I have spent my life building walls, Silas. I built walls to keep my money in and walls to keep the world out. But you... He gestured to the spring. You dug a hole, you let things out. Eliphaz looked at the boy sitting on the fine wooden bench. I am an old man, Eliphaz said softly. My sons are waiting for me to die so they can count the pomegranates. They see this estate as a ledger. He looked Silas in the eye. I want to sit on the hard stone, Silas. I want to remember that the rock is hard. I want to remember what it took to break it. You sit on the wood, you rest. You have done the digging. Silas felt a lump in his throat. He realised that this wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was an inheritance. Eliphaz was giving him dignity. He was elevating the sweeper to the level of the merchant. Master, Silas said, his voice trembling. I will keep it clean. I will polish it every day. No, Eliphaz shook his head. Don't polish it. Scratch it. Wear it out. Let it show that someone lived here. They sat in silence as the evening deepened. The water bubbled between them, a liquid table that separated them physically but connected them spiritually. The space between them was no longer a vertical gap of authority. It was a horizontal bridge of friendship. Silas took a sip of the wine. It was rich and sweet. He leaned back against the olive wood support. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a shadow to hide in. He was sitting in his own place. Tell me, Eliphaz said, breaking the silence, about the ants. You said they have a queen? Silas smiled. He relaxed. He began to talk. He told the master about the highways the ants had built under the gravel. He told him about how Goliath the lizard changed colours when the sun hit the grey bark. He told him about the spider who rebuilt her web every time the wind tore it down. Eliphaz listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't give orders. He sat on his hard stone bench, sipping his wine, learning the history of the kingdom he had unknowingly ruled. The new seat was not a throne of power, it was a seat of witnessing. And as the night fell, wrapping the green room in its protective cloak, a passerby looking into the alleyway would have seen a strange sight, a wealthy merchant and a ragged orphan sitting opposite each other, sharing bread and stories over a stream of living water, under the watchful gaze of a giant fig tree. The walls of Jericho were still standing, but in this corner the walls between men had finally come down. Stone remembers what sand forgets. In Jericho, the city of palms and dust, history is usually written in layers of destruction. Walls fall, armies march, and dynasties crumble into the white powder of the Jordan Valley. But in the corner of the estate that once belonged to Eliphaz the merchant, history was written in rings of wood and layers of moss. Decades had passed. The sharp edges of the story had been smoothed down by the river of time. Just as the rough limestone of the channel had been polished into glass, Eliphaz was gone. He'd passed away quietly one autumn evening, sitting on his hard stone bench, listening to the water. He left behind a wealthy estate to his sons and a strict, unbreakable clause in his will regarding a certain corner of the property. His sons, practical men of business, respected the deed, though they never quite understood why their father had given the prime water source to a former sweeper. Silas was no longer the boy with the broom. He was the old man of the corner. He sat on the olive wood bench, the new seat which was now old and dark, its surface worn satiny smooth by years of resting elbows and weary backs. His hair was the colour of the limestone walls, white and thick. His skin was brown and deeply lined, mapping the story of 70 summers. His hands, resting on his knees, looked strangely like the roots of the tree he guarded, knotted, strong, and capable. And Barnabas? Barnabas had become a geography unto himself. The tree had long ago outgrown the title of garden feature. It was a titan. Its trunk was no longer a single column. It was a fortress of fused aerial roots and massive boughs that measured 20 feet in circumference. It had swallowed the original stone basin, integrating the rock into its own living tissue. The water now seemed to bubble up directly from the heart of the tree itself. The canopy was a green sky. It spanned the entire width of the alleyway and spilled over the high walls, casting a permanent, cool twilight over the street outside. Travellers on the Via Maris didn't need to ask directions to the spring. They simply looked for the mountain of green rising above the white rooftops of Jericho. It was said among the caravans that the water from the tree of Silas was the sweetest in Judea. It was said that it could cure a headache, settle a stomach, or cool a fever. Silas didn't claim any magic. He just kept the leaves out of the grate. On this particular afternoon, the air was still. The heat outside the walls was oppressive, a reminder of the shower winds of long ago, but inside the sanctuary, it was a different world. The temperature dropped the moment one stepped under the archway. The air smelled of wet stone, ancient wood, and the ripe, jammy scent of fallen figs fermenting in the damp earth. Silas watched a young woman enter. She was a stranger, likely a traveller from the coast, carrying a sleeping baby in a sling. She looked exhausted, her face flushed with heat. She stopped at the edge of the green room, hesitant. She saw the massive tree, the rushing water, and the old man sitting still as a statue. Is this the public spring?" she asked, her voice hushed by the cathedral-like atmosphere. Silas smiled. His eyes crinkled at the corners. "The water belongs to everyone, daughter. Drink." She approached the basin. She unhooked a copper cup from her belt and dipped it. She drank thirstily, then dipped it again and pressed the cool metal against the baby's cheek. The child stirred but did not cry, soothed by the change in temperature. "It is so cold," the woman whispered. She looked up at the vast, intricate network of branches above her. "This tree, how old is it?" "Older than my grief," Silas answered softly. "Younger than the rock." The woman sat down on the limestone bench, Eliphaz's old seat. She sighed, the tension leaving her frame. "It feels safe here," she said. "That is the work of the roots," Silas explained. "They hold the ground steady." He watched her rest. He had seen thousands of them over the years. Roman soldiers with a dusty armour seeking a moment of peace before the march, beggars washing their sores, merchants calculating their losses. They all came to the corner of the rejected things to find restoration. Silas leaned his head back against the olive wood. He closed his eyes. He could hear the tree working. In his youth, he had to press his ear to the bark to hear the sap. Now, he felt it in the air. The tree was a massive hydraulic engine, pulling tons of water from the deep earth every day, lifting it against gravity and breathing it out into the sky. It was a silent, Herculean labour of love. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was the heartbeat of the estate. Silas thought about the boy he used to be, the starving, desperate child who had poured his own ration cup onto the dry dust. He thought about the fear of the axe. It seemed like a dream now. He looked at his hands. They had done their work. He had kept the channel clear. He had protected the source. A fig fell from the high canopy. Plop. It landed in the water, bobbing for a moment before being swept down the channel toward the grate. "Travel well," Silas whispered to the fruit. "Someone outside the wall, a child or a donkey or a bird, would find it." The tree was feeding the world beyond the walls. The young woman stood up. She looked refreshed. "Thank you, grandfather," she said. I felt like I was being watched over." "You were," Silas said, nodding to the canopy. "Barnabas sees everything." She smiled and walked away, back into the bright, harsh light of the street. Silas was alone again. The sun began to lower. The light in the sanctuary shifted from green to a deep, resonant blue. The shadows of the leaves painted intricate lace patterns on the stone floor. Silas felt a familiar tiredness settle into his bones. It wasn't the painful exhaustion of his youth. It was the gentle, heavy fatigue of job well done. It was the feeling of a sun going down after a long summer day. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of pottery shard, the rim of an old clay bowl. It was smooth, worn down by years of handling. It was a piece of the very first bowl he'd used to water the tree back when it was a stick. He turned it over in his fingers. From broken pieces, we build a river, he thought. He placed the shard on the bench beside him. "We have done well, Barnabas." Silas spoke to the tree. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves. The tree rustled in response. A breeze moved through the upper branches, sounding like a long, satisfied exhale. Silas looked at the water flowing past his feet. It was the same water, the same molecules that had cooled Eliphaz's anger, the same molecules that had saved the pomegranates. It was timeless. He knew his time as the keeper was coming to an end. His legs were slower, his back was stiffer. Soon, he would need to find a new boy, perhaps one of the gardener's sons, someone with quiet eyes to hand the broom to. But not tonight. Tonight, he was simply Silas. And the tree was simply Barnabas. And the water was the conversation between them. He watched Goliath the lizard, or perhaps the great-great-grandson of Goliath, scurry across the mossy rocks. The lineage continued. The ecosystem was intact. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the eternal hush of the stream. It was the sound of a promise that had outlived the drought. A canopy of years held him safe. The roots held the earth, and the water held the memory of it all. The moon rose high over the Jordan Valley, turning the canopy of Barnabas into a vast shimmering tent of silver and black. The city of Jericho had finally surrendered to the night. The markets were empty. The gates were barred. The noise of commerce, of arguments, of wheels turning on stone, it had all evaporated, leaving behind the immense, heavy silence of the desert. But in the sanctuary of the dead corner, the silence was alive. Silas remained on the olive wood bench. He had not moved for a long time. The air around him was cool, conditioned by the thousands of leaves breathing above him and the cold water rushing below him. It was a microclimate of peace, a bubble of grace in a weary world. He felt the age in his bones tonight. It wasn't a painful ache. It was a heaviness. It was the feeling of a ship that has crossed a wide ocean and is finally, gently, bumping against the dock. He looked at the stream. In the moonlight, the water looked like liquid mercury. It didn't look like water anymore. It looked like light that had learned how to flow. It moved with such confidence, such unending supply. Silas realized, with a sudden, quiet clarity, that the water did not need him. For 60 years, he had told himself that he was the keeper. He had told himself that if he didn't sweep the leaves, if he didn't scrub the basin, if he didn't watch the channel, the miracle would cease. He had carried the weight of the springs on his shoulders. But tonight, watching the effortless power of the flow, he knew the truth. The water was the keeper. The water had kept him. It had given him a purpose when he was invisible. It had given him a seat when he was lowly. It had given him a family of ants and birds and lizards when he was alone. "You're strong enough," Silas whispered to the stream. He slowly uncurled his hands from his lap. He let them rest, open-palmed on the smooth wood of the bench. It was a gesture of release. He was putting down the imaginary broom he'd carried for a lifetime. He looked up at the trunk of Barnabas. The tree was a mountain of wood. Its bark was scarred and rugged, a map of every drought and every storm it had survived. But it stood immovable. It had fused with the geology of the corner. "Good night, giant," Silas said softly. He didn't know if he would wake up early tomorrow. He didn't know if he would wake up at all. And strangely, the thought did not frighten him. Sleep is a form of trust. To close your eyes is to admit that you are not the one holding the world together. To sleep is to believe that the roots are deep enough to hold you while you drift away. Silas shifted his legs, finding the most comfortable groove in the wood, the groove his own body had worn over the years. He pulled the edges of his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders. He closed his eyes. Immediately, the sound of the water magnified. Hush! Hush! It was the sound of a mother shushing a child. It was the sound of the wind in the grass. It was the sound of the earth breathing. Silas let his mind drift downstream. He followed the water in his imagination. He saw it flowing out of the basin. He saw it running down the mossy channel. He saw it slipping through the iron grate in the wall. He saw it joining the dust of the road. But in his dream mind, the water didn't stop at the road. It kept going. It flowed past the city gates. It flowed into the desert. It flowed until it reached the great river Jordan, and then it flowed all the way to the sea. He was part of a cycle that had no beginning and no end. The memories of his life began to soften and dissolve, like sugar cubes in warm tea, the face of Jabin the gardener, dissolving into the shadows, the face of Eliphaz, dissolving into the light, the memory of the thirst, dissolving into the cool drink. There was only the now. There was only the sensation of the wooden bench supporting his back, the cool air touching his cheek, and the rhythm of the water soothing his heart. Inhale peace. Exhale worry. Silas breathed in the scent of the figs, sweet, ripe, and heavy. It was the smell of a finished harvest. His breathing slowed. It became shallow and rhythmic, matching the pulse of the spring. The lines of worry on his forehead smoothed out. The tension in his hands vanished. He was no longer the orphan. He was no longer the servant. He was no longer the old man. He was just a seed, falling into the soft, dark earth, waiting to be held. The moon moved across the sky, shifting the shadows in the sanctuary. The light touched Silas's face, turning his white hair into a halo of silver. He looked like a king sleeping on his throne. The water bubbled on. Glug, glug, hush. It sang of the deep rocks. It sang of the hidden reservoirs. It sang of the secret that Silas had found, that if you dig deep enough, if you wait long enough, and if you're brave enough to pour out your own cup, you will find a river that never runs dry. And so the keeper slept, and the tree stood guard, and the water flowed, eternal and free into the waiting night. Yeah. And so, the water flows on. Silas is sleeping now. The work of the broom is finished. The struggle of the drought is a memory that has faded into the mist. He has found his rest on the bench of olive wood, guarded by the friend he saved. And you, my weary traveller, you too have watered your stones today. You have poured out your energy. You have given your patience to things that seemed dry and ungrateful. You have stood in the heat of your own day, wondering if the rain would ever come. You have carried burdens that no one else saw. But listen to the sound of the spring. You do not need to carry the water anymore. The bucket is heavy, and your hands are tired. Put it down, just as Barnabas found the deep river beneath the rock. There is a rest waiting for you that is deeper than your worries. There is a strength that holds you up, even when you feel like a single curling leaf. You do not have to hold the world together tonight. You do not have to balance the books. The earth is holding you. The gravity that pulls the water down is the same gravity that pulls you into your bed. It is safe to let go. Release the tension in your shoulders. Unclench your hands. Let the thoughts of tomorrow float away like leaves on the surface of the stream. They will be taken care of. You are the keeper of your own soul, and tonight, your only duty is to rest. Sleep now in the sanctuary of the green leaves. Sleep now by the singing stream. You are safe. You are held. You are home. Good night, as was said out.